There are questions that rise within the human mind long before we learn to speak them. Questions that seem embedded in the very architecture of our curiosity, like ancient seeds waiting for the right moment to germinate. Among them is a simple yet unsettling thought: what came before us? Not in the sense of evolutionary lineage or the familiar timeline of recorded civilization, but in a deeper, more elusive sense. Who were the forgotten ancestors whose stories did not survive, whose achievements dissolved into soil and seawater, whose existence left only fragments too faint for us to easily recognize? This is where our journey begins, with a mystery older than writing, older than the pyramids, older even than agriculture. A mystery older than memory itself. For most of modern history, we've believed that civilization began around 6,000 years ago, blossoming swiftly in the fertile valleys of the Nile, the Tigris, and the Indus. We accepted this timeline because that is where our earliest surviving records appear: stone tablets, city ruins, and architectural grandeur. Yet survival is not a measure of truth, only a measure of luck. And human history is not written in stone alone. Much of it is written in places that stone cannot endure. Imagine a world long before the first cities rose from dust. Vast ice sheets stretched across continents. Oceans were lower, exposing land bridges now drowned beneath the waves. Human beings, anatomically identical to us, walked through forests, grasslands, and river valleys, forming communities that laughed, struggled, dreamed, and wondered just as we do. But what if some of those communities did more than merely survive? What if they organized, innovated, and created in ways that challenge everything we assume about the arc of civilization? This question isn't born from fantasy. It comes from evidence, scattered, subtle, often controversial, but impossible to ignore. Strange anomalies in archaeological layers. Myths shared across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge appearing in places and times where it should not logically exist. Each clue is small on its own, but together they form the outline of something tantalizing, something we have not yet decoded. Could an advanced culture have existed 12,000, or even 15,000 years ago, long before the earliest known civilizations? Could there have been societies that mastered techniques, sciences, or forms of social organization that flourished briefly, then vanished beneath the pressures of climate catastrophe or shifting geography? And if they did, how would we even know? Because the truth is, the world has changed so dramatically since the last ice age that entire landscapes, entire histories, could lie hidden. The shorelines we know today were once miles inland. The plains that humans walked are now deep underwater. Valleys that held life and settlement were carved away by floods of unimaginable force. If a culture rose in that era, even a sophisticated one, its remains may now be buried beneath oceans, glaciers, volcanic ash, or thousands of years of forest growth. We have inherited only the faintest echoes. Human memory, too, is fragile. We live in a world where a single generation can forget what the previous one learned. Knowledge can vanish without catastrophe, lost simply because it was not written down, or because those who held it were scattered. A small, vulnerable culture, no matter how brilliant, could fade into myth in just a few centuries. And after 12,000 years, myth is often all that remains. Yet myths can be clues. Across the world, from the Andes to Mesopotamia, from Polynesia to the Arctic, cultures share stories of a time before the current age, a time when the world was destroyed and reborn. Floods. Fires. Falling skies. Lost homelands swallowed by rising seas. These stories, though wrapped in symbolism, carry a strange consistency. Were they invented entirely? Or are they memories, distorted, poetic, but real, passed through countless generations? The possibility that they are memories leads us into uncomfortable terrain. It suggests that our linear model of history, simple, tidy, confident, is incomplete. Human history may not be a straight line but a fractured one, interrupted by climate chaos, geological upheaval, and cultural resets that erased more than they preserved. And so, we must ask, what are we missing? Not just objects or ruins, but entire chapters of the human journey. This documentary begins with an open mind, not with the assumption that an advanced ancient society definitely existed, but with the recognition that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. The Earth is vast. Most of its archaeology remains unexplored. The deep ocean floor, the dense jungles, the deserts, and the submerged continental shelves hold more secrets than we can currently imagine. As we move through this story, we will examine the clues, the geological record, the archaeological anomalies, the environmental transformations that erased civilizations, the global patterns in mythology, the cognitive sophistication of early humans, and the philosophical meaning of advanced itself. Was advancement measured by technology? By social harmony? By astronomical knowledge? Or by a deep understanding of the natural world that we, despite our modern tools, have lost? Each section will peel back another layer of the mystery. But here, at the beginning, we pause. Not to claim answers, but to marvel at the questions. To stand in the vast silence of prehistory and listen for the echoes of people whose names we will never know. To imagine the possibility that the world once held cultures as complex, as creative, and as intelligent as ours, cultures that rose and fell long before the stories we consider ancient were ever told. This is not a story about aliens or lost continents of fantasy. It is a story about humans, humans like us, with the same minds and the same capacity for wonder. Humans who lived in a world both familiar and impossibly wild. Humans whose achievements, if they existed, lie scattered like dust across the millennia. Our journey starts with humility. With the recognition that the past is far deeper, far stranger, and far more mysterious than we have allowed ourselves to believe. And somewhere, buried beneath ice, earth, or ocean, answers may still be waiting. To understand whether an advanced culture could have existed 10,000 years ago, we must first step into their world, a world perched delicately between two eras. It was a time when the Great Ice Age was drawing its final breath, yet its presence still shaped everything: the land, the climate, the migrations of animals, and even the psychology of the humans who wandered its edges. The Earth was not the calm, predictable planet we inhabit today. It was restless, trembling, warming unevenly, and shedding its frozen skin. Imagine standing in a vast plain where winter lingers not for months, but for generations. Towering glaciers, walls of blue-white ice, rose thousands of meters high, stretching beyond the horizon. These were not the quiet glaciers we know today, they were alive, groaning, cracking, and collapsing as temperatures slowly climbed. Each break of ice thundered across valleys, echoing like distant drums. Meltwater carved new rivers, turning once frozen lands into muddy, unstable marshes. For the humans of that time, these transformations were not geological, they were personal, immediate, and terrifying. But the world was not uniformly cold. Even as glaciers retreated, pockets of warmth appeared, green oases where vegetation flourished and animals gathered. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant sloths, enormous bison, and saber-toothed cats still roamed. Humans shared the land with megafauna that dwarfed anything alive today. Every step into a forest, every journey across a valley came with the knowledge that a creature twice your height and 10 times your strength could be waiting. The landscape was a mosaic of contrasts: ice walls beside blooming meadows, raging meltwater rivers running through ancient tundra, storms born from the collision of warm and cold air masses. Weather shifted violently. A single season could bring floods, droughts, and sudden freezes. Yet despite this instability, humans adapted. They hunted, gathered, built shelters, created tools, and formed communities capable of surviving in one of the most unpredictable climates Earth ever produced. It was in this shifting environment that humanity's resilience and intelligence reached new heights. People learned to read the subtle language of the land, the migration patterns of animals, the cycles of plants, the timing of glacial melts. They observed the stars to predict seasons, navigated by the sun and moon, and used stone, bone, and wood with remarkable skill. Their world demanded ingenuity, and they responded with creativity. But perhaps most importantly, this was a time when the Earth itself was rewriting its shape. Sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today. Entire continents were larger. Land bridges connected regions that are now separated by vast oceans. Europe, the Middle East, and Asia formed a nearly continuous belt of habitable terrain. Southeast Asia was not an archipelago but a massive landmass known as Sundaland. What is now the English Channel was a fertile region called Doggerland. Coastlines stretched far beyond their present boundaries, creating thousands of kilometers of shoreline that are now submerged underwater. If a society, advanced or otherwise, had risen along these ancient coasts, its remains would now lie beneath the sea, hidden under layers of silt and sand. The ocean is a master of concealment, erasing structures, scattering artifacts, and burying signs of human presence beneath darkness and pressure. At the same time, inland landscapes were transforming as well. As ice sheets melted, they unleashed unimaginable volumes of water. Entire rivers rerouted. Lakes swelled and burst. Floodplains expanded. Forests swallowed open plains, and deserts swallowed rivers. In such an unstable environment, any attempt at settled life would face constant threat, yet also great opportunity. The melting glaciers not only flooded land, they revealed it. Fresh soil, rich nutrients, and newly exposed valleys encouraged human movement. Game animals thrived in these emerging ecosystems, drawing hunter-gatherer groups into fertile regions where experimentation with early agriculture may have begun. In some places, cyclical patterns of plant growth became predictable enough for humans to cultivate intentionally. The seeds of domestication, of both crops and animals, were being planted, whether consciously or by accident. This was the crucible in which early complexity could emerge. A society living at the margins of ice had access to abundant resources, fresh game, fresh water, raw materials, and shifting territories that required adaptability. But they also faced danger at every turn: rising waters, unstable climates, and megafaunal predators. This pressure cooker of survival may have sparked innovation far earlier than we typically assume. The humans of this era were not primitive in their thinking. They had language, tradition, memory, and the capacity to strategize. They built shelters that could withstand brutal cold. They created clothing tailored for different seasons. They traded materials across vast distances: stone from the Caucasus found in Europe, shells from the Mediterranean found hundreds of kilometers inland. These networks suggest not isolation, but connection. Not simplicity, but complexity. So imagine, for a moment, that within this world of instability and abundance, a few groups began to organize differently. Perhaps they settled in regions where glacial meltwater created stable valleys. Perhaps they built ritual sites not merely to worship, but to chart the stars or measure seasons. Perhaps they recorded knowledge, not on fragile materials that could rot or wash away, but through oral tradition, symbolic carving, or structures aligned with celestial cycles. If an advanced culture began to form during this transitional period, the Earth itself would become its greatest threat. Every innovation could be undone by a single climate event. A village could be drowned in a night. A valley could be covered by advancing ice. A coastline could vanish as the sea rushed inland. And that is the haunting possibility, that a culture might rise, flourish briefly, and then disappear almost completely, erased not by war or failure, but by the violent evolution of the planet. As we leave this section, we carry with us an image of a world both beautiful and brutal. A world at war with itself, ice melting, seas rising, land shifting, animals migrating, storms colliding. A world in which human beings were not yet the rulers of Earth, but resilient survivors navigating a landscape that changed faster than memory could hold. It is within this world, at the edge of ice and the dawn of warmth, that our question grows sharper: not could an advanced culture have existed, but how could it have survived long enough to be remembered? If we could drain the oceans, pull back every drop of water and expose the hidden scars of the planet, we would discover a second Earth beneath the surface. A drowned world, immense and silent, stretching across the continents like a forgotten map. It is here, beneath hundreds of meters of water, that some of the most important chapters of human history may be concealed. And perhaps, it is here that the traces of an early advanced culture lie waiting. 10,000 years ago, the world's shorelines were not where they are today. The planet was colder, and so much of Earth's water was locked inside glaciers that sea levels were more than 100 meters lower. Vast coastal plains existed where oceans now roll. Rivers flowed along paths that today sit far under the waves. Entire regions, fertile, temperate, and ideal for settlement, are now unreachable to archaeologists using conventional methods. These lost coastlines were the frontiers of early humanity, the places where life was abundant and predictable. Freshwater rivers met the nutrient-rich sea. Fish migrated in great schools. Forests thrived along the edges. For a species that relied on both land and water for survival, these coastlines would have been magnets, places where communities gathered, traded, learned, and possibly built something more permanent than the wandering camps of earlier ages. Yet almost none of this world remains accessible. The ocean has claimed it. Consider Doggerland, the land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. Today it sits under the cold waters of the North Sea. But in the late Ice Age, it was a thriving expanse of hills, rivers, lakes, and meadows, a place where deer grazed and humans hunted, lived, and raised families. Excavations from fishing trawlers have pulled up tools, bones, weapons, and even remnants of ancient forests preserved beneath thick sediment. Doggerland was not a barren bridge, it was a homeland. And it vanished within a few thousand years, swallowed by rising seas. If a culture developed there, more complex, more organized, more innovative than we expect, it would now lie scattered beneath silt, unreachable, its story muted by the waves. But Doggerland is only one example. The Sunda Shelf, thousands of kilometers away, once formed a vast subcontinent linking modern Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Australia. It was an enormous region filled with rivers, fertile soil, and stable climates, perfect conditions for human settlement. Yet today, almost all of it lies underwater, hidden beneath the shallow seas of Southeast Asia. Imagine the scale of what could be lost there: settlements, gathering sites, stone structures, or early centers of exchange. The region was so large and ecologically rich that humans likely moved through it for tens of thousands of years. And as sea levels rose, sometimes suddenly, during immense glacial melt events, entire communities could have disappeared overnight. We must also consider the Indian coastline, where fishermen have uncovered stone structures beneath the waters off Gujarat, stirring debates about whether they represent natural formations or truly ancient ruins. The Persian Gulf once held a massive oasis-like basin fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, and rivers now forgotten. The Caribbean Basin, parts of Japan, the Beringian coast, and the shores of ancient Australia all hold submerged landscapes that could contain the earliest footprints of human complexity. The challenge is simple: archaeology beneath the sea is extraordinarily difficult. Even with modern technology, mapping hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of submerged terrain is beyond our current capability. Most underwater discoveries happen by accident, caught in nets, disturbed by storms, or detected during unrelated surveys. If a prehistoric society lived along these drowned coasts, the chances of discovering it with present methods are incredibly small. And that is why the idea of a forgotten culture remains plausible, not sensational, not speculative, but genuinely grounded in what we know about Earth's shifting geography. The ocean does not preserve history the way dry land does. Wind, currents, erosion, chemical reactions, and biological growth all conspire to erase human presence. Wood rots. Metal corrodes. Bones dissolve. Even stone structures, after 10,000 years of waves, can crumble into debris indistinguishable from natural formations. A city built of organic material, wooden longhouses, reed structures, cloth, rope, clay, would vanish completely. Think about our own world. If our civilization vanished today, in 10,000 years the forests and oceans would reclaim almost everything. Steel bridges would crumble. Skyscrapers would collapse. Cars would rust into dust. Billions of books would disintegrate. Even our technologies, computers, plastics, circuitry, would degrade into unrecognizable fragments. Only a handful of durable stone structures would survive in any identifiable form. Now imagine a much smaller civilization from 12,000 years ago, one far more vulnerable to the elements, one using materials almost exclusively organic. All evidence of their existence could be lost in even less time, especially if their homes were built near coastlines that later drowned. This forces us to confront a quiet truth: most of human history is missing, not because it never happened, but because it did not survive. And when we add rising seas to the equation, the missing chapters only multiply. For early humans, coastlines were not the margins, they were the heart of life. The place where fresh water met salt, where rivers delivered nutrients, where fish and shellfish provided steady food, where trade routes were easy to follow, and where communities could settle without needing to chase migrating herds. If anything resembling early civilization first emerged, the coast is where it would likely take shape. Yet the coast is precisely what we have lost. And so, we are left with a haunting possibility, that what we see on land today, the scattered artifacts, the occasional stone circle, the fragments of hunter-gatherer camps, is only a fraction of the full picture. That the true centers of early complexity might lie hidden under oceans, erased by time, waiting for technology advanced enough to find them. We stand at the edge of this underwater silence, imagining the footprints buried beneath waves. Footprints that were made by people who lived in a world we no longer see, on lands that no longer exist. And if those footprints belong to a society more advanced than we expect, one that organized itself, built ritual sites, tracked the stars, or cultivated early forms of agriculture, then their story would be among the easiest to erase and the hardest to rediscover. Perhaps the question is not whether such a culture existed, but whether we will ever uncover enough of the drowned world to prove it. When we search for humanity's earliest stories, we rarely find complete chapters. Instead, we uncover fragments, tiny, stubborn pieces left behind by chance rather than intention. A broken carving. A shard of pottery. A stone tool buried beneath layers of earth older than recorded language. These fragments often tell us far less than we wish, but far more than we expect. They hint at a complexity that does not fit neatly into the timelines we've constructed. And it is from these incomplete traces that controversy, and curiosity, begins. Consider for a moment how archaeology works. We do not discover ancient civilizations by reading their biographies. We reconstruct their lives from whatever survived the slow grinding of time. Most of the past is lost before we even think to search for it. What remains are puzzles, pieces without edges, images without context. And it is within these puzzles that the anomalies emerge. Among the most intriguing are artifacts found in layers far older than our models suggest they should exist. Stone tools appearing in places where no mainstream evidence of sustained human presence was expected. Microscopic traces of early agriculture emerging thousands of years before agriculture was believed possible. Burial sites with social complexity that predates our definitions of organized society. These discoveries are often dismissed at first, sometimes because they contradict long-established narratives, sometimes because they are simply too incomplete to draw firm conclusions from. Yet each one whispers the same question: are we underestimating the capabilities and achievements of ancient humans? Take Göbekli Tepe, often highlighted as the earliest temple complex, built around 9600 BCE. Nothing else from that era, or even thousands of years later, resembles its massive stone pillars, intricate carvings, or sophisticated layout. According to our traditional view of history, hunter-gatherers were not supposed to organize, plan, carve megaliths, or build monumental ritual sites. They were transient, concerned with survival, unable to devote labor to architecture. Yet Göbekli Tepe exists, stubbornly refusing to fit the mold. If one site like this can overturn assumptions, how many more might exist, undiscovered or erased? We also find unusual symbols carved into stone, repeating patterns across continents and millennia. Spirals, grids, animals, celestial shapes. Are these merely decorations? Or are they remnants of a shared symbolic language, an early form of communication that has faded beyond recognition? Without context, we cannot know. But the patterns are there, etched into rock by hands that lived thousands of generations before us. Then there are the small moments, the subtle traces that rarely make headlines but carry profound meaning. Long-distance trade routes implied by materials found hundreds of miles from their source. Diets showing early cultivation of plants once believed to be wild. Social structures inferred from burial sites where individuals were interred with objects of personal significance. These are not signs of primitive wanderers stumbling through existence. They are signs of people thinking ahead, organizing themselves, valuing symbolic expression, and building traditions. When these fragments are viewed individually, they are curiosities. When viewed together, they hint at a larger pattern, one of innovation, experimentation, and social coordination that we have not fully acknowledged in early human history. Yet because these traces are incomplete, they are difficult to interpret. A single tool does not prove a city. A single symbol does not prove a writing system. A single burial does not prove a hierarchical society. But taken collectively, they raise an unsettling possibility. Our timeline may represent not the beginning of civilization, but simply the earliest chapter that survived. And we must remember that the absence of evidence is shaped by the rules of preservation itself. Organic materials, wood, fiber, rope, clothing, baskets, early writing surfaces, are almost always lost. If ancient societies used these materials extensively, the traces of their lives would vanish almost entirely. A group could build advanced wooden structures, create symbolic art using dyes, or record information on bark or leather, and none of it would survive 10,000 years of erosion, flooding, and microbial decay. Even stone can fail us. Erosion, earthquakes, frost, and shifting soil grind structures into rubble. If an early society relied on natural caves, temporary buildings, or coastal settlements, the archaeological record would be almost silent. This is why the fragments matter so deeply. They are the rare survivors, the exceptions to time's relentless erasure. And their existence suggests that the world we imagine for ancient humans may be far too limited. As we sift through the dust, literally and metaphorically, we must confront our assumptions. History is not a straight progression from primitive to advanced. It is a story shaped by environment, disaster, human ingenuity, and the fragile nature of memory. We often assume that earlier humans were incapable of complexity because we have found little evidence of it. But perhaps we have found little evidence because we have been looking only where the earth allows us to see, and ignoring the vast, hidden landscapes where evidence would never survive. The fragments challenge us to think differently. To accept uncertainty. To allow ourselves to wonder whether something greater once existed, something organized, symbolic, structured, yet vulnerable to the catastrophes and climatic upheavals of the late Ice Age. These are not fantasies. They are questions emerging from real artifacts, real discoveries, and real scientific humility. And every new fragment, every stone, every carving, every unexpected layer, expands the possibility that the story of humanity before 10,000 BCE is not simply unknown, but profoundly misunderstood. In the dust of forgotten ages, the faint outlines of a lost world remain. All we can do now is trace them, piece by piece, and follow where the fragments lead. When we imagine humans living 10 or even 20,000 years ago, we often picture people who were somehow less than us, less intelligent, less capable, less imaginative. But this image is a distortion created not by evidence, but by distance. Time has a strange way of making our ancestors appear primitive simply because they lived before us. Yet biologically, cognitively, and emotionally, the humans who walked the earth in the late Pleistocene were our equals. Their brains were the same size, the same structure, the same remarkable engine capable of memory, creativity, and introspection. In other words, if you could bring a child from 15,000 years ago into the modern world and raise them today, they would blend seamlessly with the rest of us. They could become a scientist, an artist, an engineer, a philosopher. Their intelligence was not limited by biology, it was limited only by environment, technology, and the fragile thread of cultural continuity that determines how knowledge is preserved. This truth opens the door to a profound question: if ancient humans had the same cognitive abilities we have today, what might they have achieved in the tens of thousands of years before recorded history? Modern civilization, its cities, writing systems, mathematics, agriculture, engineering, did not arise because humans suddenly became smarter. It arose because specific environmental and cultural conditions aligned in just the right way. But intelligence itself has been with us for far longer. Archaeology supports this. Deep within caves across Europe, Africa, and Asia, we find art that rivals the imagination and skill of Renaissance painters. Hand stencils, animal portraits, abstract symbols, all rendered with an understanding of perspective, shading, and symbolic meaning. Some of this art is more than 40,000 years old. The minds that created it were not primitive. They were expressive, observant, emotionally complex. They understood beauty. They understood storytelling. They understood themselves. And in these caves, separated by oceans and time, we find patterns, recurring symbols that appear in multiple regions. The same shapes, the same motifs, the same geometric language. Is this coincidence? Is it cultural diffusion? Or is it evidence of a deeper shared symbolic system, perhaps an early precursor to writing? If so, then humans tens of thousands of years ago were already experimenting with forms of communication beyond speech. Their tools also reveal sophistication. Perfectly shaped spear points, finely carved bone needles, woven baskets whose designs suggest mathematical thought. Some stone tools require dozens of precise strikes to produce a consistent edge, techniques passed through generations, requiring apprenticeship and knowledge transfer as rigorous as any modern craft. Yet tools are only the beginning. What truly reveals ancient intelligence is the social world these people built. Burials from the Upper Paleolithic show evidence of ritual practice, social status, and emotional depth. Bodies were adorned with beads, pigments, and carefully arranged objects. Some individuals were buried with care far exceeding what mere survival required. This suggests not just symbolic thinking, but a concept of identity, memory, and meaning. And meaning requires intellect. These humans also possessed a deep understanding of the natural world, an understanding developed over countless generations of close observation. They knew the cycles of the moon, the migration of animals, the behavior of plants, the chemistry of fire, the patterns of seasons, and the unspoken language of weather. Much of this knowledge is invisible in the archaeological record because it was stored not in artifacts, but in minds. When we say they were hunter-gatherers, we risk diminishing the extraordinary breadth of their knowledge. A hunter-gatherer could identify hundreds of edible plants, track an animal across impossible terrain, read the sky like a map, and survive in environments that would kill modern people within days. Their intelligence was not expressed through machines, but through mastery of the living world. Still, intelligence alone does not create civilization. For complexity to flourish, people need stability, settled food sources, predictable climate, and the ability to accumulate knowledge across generations. In a world dominated by ice sheets and shifting weather, these conditions were rare. But wherever they appeared, humans responded with rapid innovation. Göbekli Tepe is a testament to this. So are the early settlements in the Near East, the Jaman sites of Japan, and ancient ritual centers scattered across Africa. These societies show bursts of creativity, organization, and engineering that seem to come out of nowhere. But they did not emerge from nowhere, they emerged from minds fully capable of imagination, planning, and mastery. Now imagine, for a moment, a group of humans living in a particularly stable refuge, perhaps a fertile river valley sheltered from the worst effects of the Ice Age. Imagine they learned to cultivate wild grains, not as full agriculture but as early land management. Imagine they built semi-permanent structures using wood or reeds, materials long since destroyed. Imagine they developed a tradition of ritual gathering, astronomical observation, or symbolic communication. Nothing in biology or cognition would prevent this. In fact, the only thing preventing it would be environmental disruption strong enough to break continuity. Thus the haunting possibility emerges: intelligence may have sparked complexity many times throughout human history, only for climate and catastrophe to erase the results. We tend to think of civilization as something linear, slowly progressing upward from primitive beginnings. But evolution is not a straight line. It is a series of attempts, collapses, adaptations, and rediscoveries. A society could develop certain advancements, lose them during a climate disaster, and regain them thousands of years later under new conditions. If that happened, the archaeological record would show only the later rediscovery, not the earlier invention. This means the true story of humanity may not be one continuous rise, but a rhythm of forgotten peaks and valleys, each shaped by people whose minds were as sharp, curious, and inventive as ours. And so, the question is not whether ancient humans were capable of building advanced societies; they absolutely were. The question is whether they had the opportunity to sustain those societies long enough to leave lasting evidence. The world of the late Pleistocene was unstable. Floods, volcanic eruptions, sudden cold snaps, and dramatic sea level rise could extinguish communities in a single generation. A flourishing center of innovation could be reduced to ash, mud, or ocean floor in a matter of days. What remains today are scattered hints: art that suggests imagination, tools that suggest engineering, symbols that suggest language, burials that suggest belief, and artifacts that challenge conventional timelines. These are the footprints of minds just like ours, capable of wonder, capable of greatness, capable of building something extraordinary in a world that did not yet allow permanence. As we move deeper into this story, we must carry this truth: the humans of 10,000 plus years ago were not our primitive ancestors. They were us. And if they were us, then the possibility of a lost advanced culture becomes not merely plausible, but almost inevitable. If an ancient culture existed more than 10,000 years ago, it would not resemble the massive stone cities we associate with later civilizations. But stone, when it does survive, still speaks. And sometimes it whispers things our timelines struggle to explain. Across the world are places where architecture appears earlier, more complex, or more deliberate than it has any right to be, sites that stand like lone survivors of forgotten experiments in human organization. Among them is Göbekli Tepe, often described but rarely understood in its full significance. Built around 9600 BCE, it predates agriculture, pottery, writing, and settled life as mainstream history defines it. Yet the people who carved its towering pillars, weighing tons each, were hunter-gatherers. They had no villages, no farms, no domesticated animals aside from dogs. And yet they built something monumental, something that required planning, cooperation, artistry, and, most importantly, purpose. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are arranged in circles, some aligned with celestial events. Intricate carvings of animals and symbols decorate their faces. The architecture suggests a ritual or ceremonial function, an early temple built not by farmers, but by mobile groups motivated by shared belief. This alone overturns the assumption that civilization emerges from agriculture. It hints at something deeper, a cultural complexity that predates what we traditionally call civilization by thousands of years. If a site like this can exist, how many others have been lost? The temples of Malta, dating several millennia later, appear suddenly and without precursor. Catalhoyuk, a dense proto-city with no streets and an egalitarian social structure, emerges around 7500 BCE with art, ritual, and burial customs far more developed than expected for its time. In South America, ancient sites show evidence of ceremonial architecture long before full urban societies arose. Scattered across Africa are stone circles, astronomical markers, and ritual complexes whose origins stretch beyond our neat historical frameworks. Each of these sites stands isolated, like peaks of a submerged mountain range whose connecting slopes have eroded away. We see the summit, but not the structure that once connected them. Yet even these survivor sites are incomplete. Wind, rain, earthquakes, erosion, and shifting geology have erased more than they preserved. Stone, especially soft limestone and sandstone, wears away easily over thousands of years. Carvings fade. Walls collapse. Entire buildings can crumble into unrecognizable rubble. And the organic materials, wooden roofs, reed walls, woven floors, have disintegrated entirely. Imagine a structure built of wood, clay, and plant fibers, a community hall, a ritual enclosure, a market shelter. After 12,000 years, nothing would remain. Not even dust. Only if the structure had a stone foundation or survived in an unusually dry cave would any trace appear. But most human activity did not occur in caves, it occurred in open settlements now consumed by time. This is where the silence comes from. A silence created not by the absence of human complexity, but by the natural decay of everything they built. Stone plazas may have crumbled. Ritual enclosures may have collapsed. Entire villages may have been buried under layers of mud from ancient floods. And when sea levels surged at the end of the Ice Age, any coastal structures, even stone ones, would have been battered, tumbled, and permanently submerged. But silence is not emptiness. Sometimes what is missing speaks louder than what survives. Consider the precision of megalithic alignments found in Europe and the Middle East. Stones placed to track solstices and equinoxes show a level of astronomical awareness that implies long-term observation and cultural importance. But why do these alignments appear so early, at a time when society was supposed to be simple? Observation requires continuity, knowledge passed through generations, patterns recorded, rituals repeated. Yet we find no earlier structures from which this knowledge might have developed. It is as though we walked into a theater halfway through the play. The characters are speaking their lines with confidence, following a plot we cannot fully understand, and yet the opening act, where their motivations and histories were established, is missing entirely. Perhaps the most haunting detail is Göbekli Tepe's deliberate burial. The site was not abandoned naturally, it was intentionally covered with earth by the very people who built it. This suggests both reverence and purpose, but it also raises questions. Why bury something so monumental, so meaningful? Was the burial symbolic, ritualistic, or protective? Or was it part of a larger cultural collapse, an ending we do not yet understand? The silence of lost cities is not just physical. It is conceptual. It is the quiet void left behind when the continuity of knowledge is broken. If a society rises and falls within a few centuries, if environmental change scatters its people, if oral traditions fade, if rituals lose meaning, then the memory of that society can vanish within just a few generations. Without writing or durable records, a culture can disappear so cleanly that even its descendants forget it ever existed. And this is the possibility we must confront. What if early complexity emerged more than once, only to be erased or forgotten each time by catastrophe, migration, or simple entropy? In that case, the sites we find today are not beginnings, they are echoes. Echoes of experiments in social organization that flourished briefly before being extinguished or transformed beyond recognition. We walk through these ruins today, Göbekli Tepe, Malta, Catalhoyuk, as though they are isolated wonders. But perhaps they are the last surviving whispers of a wider tapestry, a network of early cultures whose threads have dissolved. What remains is silence, shaped by the passage of time, waiting for us to listen closely enough to fill in the missing pieces. The end of the Ice Age did not arrive gently. It came like a long, uneven exhale from the planet itself, a series of sharp, sudden shifts interrupted by moments of deceptive calm. For thousands of years, massive glaciers had shaped the world, locking oceans into frozen continents and carving valleys with their slow, relentless weight. But as the climate warmed, these giants began to die. They cracked, groaned, and collapsed, releasing unimaginable amounts of water into rivers and seas. Humanity lived through this transformation, not as observers of geological history, but as vulnerable participants standing on the trembling edge of a changing world. Imagine the sound, the roar of ice cliffs collapsing into churning meltwater, the thunder of floods racing through valleys, the groaning earth as ancient pressures released. For early humans, the world must have seemed alive, unpredictable, and capable of destruction beyond anything they had ever known. This was the Great Melting, a global reset that reshaped landscapes, drowned homelands, and forced entire populations to migrate. Sea levels rose not gradually but in pulses, sometimes meters within a single century. Whole river systems transformed. Plants and animals shifted their ranges. The environment that shaped humanity for millennia was disappearing under their feet. In this era of instability, any society, advanced or otherwise, would face enormous challenges. Imagine a settlement built along a fat, meandering river that once flowed gently through fertile plains. Generations had lived there, hunted there, perhaps even experimented with early forms of agriculture. Now, as the glaciers melted upstream, that river could swell beyond recognition, transforming into a violent torrent that consumed fields, homes, and sacred spaces. What had once been a cradle of abundance would become a graveyard of drowned stones and uprooted memories. And this happened not once, but over and over. The climate of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene was marked by abrupt changes. The Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions around 12,900 years ago, brought freezing temperatures and massive ecological disruption. Then, just as suddenly, the world warmed again around 11,700 years ago. These rapid shifts created cycles of collapse and opportunity, cycles that ancient societies were forced to navigate with creativity and resilience. But there is a limit to resilience. There are forces no society can withstand. One of the most dramatic possibilities lies in the megafloods triggered by glacial lakes bursting. When enormous lakes formed behind melting ice dams finally broke, they released water at volumes and speeds we can barely imagine. Walls of water, hundreds of feet high, raced across continents, sweeping away everything in their path. Trees, animals, settlements, tools, structures, nothing could survive the force of these floods. Entire regions could be reset within hours, their histories erased by sediment and silence. For people living along what are now submerged coastlines, the cataclysm would have been even more devastating. Rising seas did not simply climb the shores, they surged inland in massive waves. Island chains disappeared. Peninsulas became archipelagos. Fertile valleys became bays and gulfs. Communities that had thrived near ancient coasts would have been forced to flee, carrying only what they could hold. Stone structures, wooden homes, ritual enclosures, anything left behind would soon vanish below the rising waters. In this chaotic world, survival required movement, adaptability, and courage. Humans followed the shifting herds of animals, explored newly exposed land, and abandoned drowning territories. But in the process, knowledge could be lost. Traditions could scatter. Elders could die before passing on essential teachings. A society built on stability could fracture in a single generation. If an early advanced culture had begun to take shape, perhaps experimenting with astronomy, symbolic communication, trade networks, or organized ritual, its progress could have been halted abruptly by climate catastrophe. The Great Melting was not merely an environmental event, it was a cultural filter. Only those ideas that could be carried in memory survived. Anything dependent on location, structure, or long-term stability was vulnerable to extinction. And so, the possibility arises that early complexity may have emerged, thrived briefly, and then disappeared without leaving clear traces. But what did the people of that era think? How did they interpret the Earth's violent transformation? We cannot know their exact stories, but we do know that myths from dozens of cultures speak of floods, fire from the sky, sudden darkness, or worlds swallowed by water. These stories are not identical, but they share a tone, a sense of loss, fear, and awe. They speak of ancestors displaced, sacred lands destroyed, and the need to rebuild from nothing. Perhaps these myths are fragments of real memories from those who witnessed the great melting firsthand. Imagine sitting beside a fire thousands of years ago as an elder recounts the tale of a homeland lost to rising seas. The story would not be a scientific explanation, it would be a warning, a lesson, a cultural anchor. Over generations, the details would shift, symbolism would grow, but the emotional truth would remain: the world once changed violently, and it could change again. This is the human legacy of the Great Melting, trauma woven into oral traditions, preserved not in stone but in story. Yet, even within this chaos, humans persisted. They adapted. They learned new survival strategies, explored new lands, and forged new social networks. In some regions, the end of the Ice Age created opportunities rather than destruction. Fresh rivers brought fish. Newly exposed soils encouraged plant growth. Forests spread across the continents, offering wood, food, and shelter. The Great Melting was both an ending and a beginning. But its destructive power cannot be ignored. It serves as a reminder that human history is shaped not only by innovation but by catastrophe. And if a culture had risen before or during this period, whether advanced or simply more complex than we currently know, its erasure would have been almost guaranteed. The Earth was not a stable home. It was a shifting, unpredictable force that demanded constant adaptation. This volatility created opportunities for experimentation, but also ensured that little could endure long enough to form the durable layers of history we rely on today. As we reflect on this era, we see a world where progress could flicker like a flame in the wind, bright for a moment, then extinguished by forces beyond human control. Perhaps somewhere in those lost centuries, a spark of complexity ignited, only to be extinguished by the Great Melting. And if so, then the evidence of that early brilliance may lie buried beneath layers of mud, sediment, and ocean, a silent testament to a chapter of the human story erased by the planet's restless transformation. Long before humans built cities or carved their histories onto clay tablets, they told stories. Stories were the first archives, the first libraries, the first vessels of memory capable of surviving generations. When knowledge could not be written, it had to be carried, in voices, in rituals, in the collective imagination of entire communities. And across the world, separated by oceans and millennia, these stories often describe the same haunting themes: a world destroyed, a flood rising from the seas, a golden age lost, a homeland swallowed by catastrophe. These similarities are not superficial. They appear in dozens of cultures that could not have communicated with one another: the ancient Sumerians, the Australian Aboriginals, the Maya, the Yoruba, the Greeks, the Maori, the tribes of Siberia, the people of India, and countless others. Their stories speak of a time before time, when the world was reshaped and humanity was forced to begin again. When myths repeat across continents, we are faced with a choice. Either they are coincidences, remarkable ones, or they encode memories of events that were once experienced globally or near globally. The Great Melting, with its sudden floods and violent climatic shifts, fits this pattern well. If ancient societies witnessed coastlines disappearing, rivers bursting, and great storms sweeping across the land, those experiences would have etched themselves into collective memory so deeply that even millennia could not fully erase them. But these myths do more than describe destruction. They also hint at civilizations that came before. In the myths of Mesopotamia, the flood was the end of an earlier age when humans lived differently, closer to the gods, wiser in ways we no longer understand. The Greek story of Atlantis speaks of a powerful society that fell beneath the sea in a single day and night. The Hopi tell of previous worlds destroyed by fire, ice, and water, with survivors beginning anew each time. The Tamil people of India preserve memories of Kumari Kandam, a lost land submerged by rising seas. Polynesian traditions describe Hawaii, a homeland swallowed by the ocean. These stories are not archaeological evidence, but they are cultural evidence, evidence of shared memory, passed through countless generations. The details vary, but the emotional essence remains: something existed before, something fell, and something was forgotten. It is easy to dismiss myths as fiction. But for ancient peoples, storytelling was not entertainment, it was survival. Myths encoded warnings, histories, and lessons in forms that were memorable and meaningful. If a great flood wiped out a settlement, future generations needed to remember the danger, even if they didn't understand the climate mechanics behind it. So they told the story again and again, shaped it with symbolism, and wove it into the identity of the people. This possibility, that myths preserve genuine memories of prehistoric events, forces us to reconsider how much of human history is hidden within narrative rather than stone. It also suggests something deeper: memory can outlive evidence. Imagine a small settlement with early structures, a gathering place, perhaps even ritual significance. When the Great Melting came, it might have been destroyed in a single catastrophic event. All physical remains would vanish under water or be scattered beyond recognition. But the people who survived would carry the memory forward. They would speak of a time when their ancestors lived in a land that no longer exists, where something precious was lost. Over centuries, that story would become a legend. After millennia, it would become a myth. And after 12,000 years, it would reach us transformed, but still recognizable. This is the power of oral tradition: it can outlast cities. Even today, some indigenous cultures retain memories of events thousands of years old. Australian Aboriginal stories describe rising sea levels that match geological reconstructions. Native American tribes preserve stories of volcanic eruptions that occurred long before written history. Polynesian navigators memorized entire ocean maps through songs, retaining knowledge no stone record could preserve. If these stories can survive thousands of years in recognizable form, why couldn't memories from the end of the Ice Age survive as well? Now imagine the opposite perspective, not from the survivors, but from the lost cultures themselves. What stories might they have told? What myths might they have carried? What warnings might they have whispered into the ears of their children? What rituals might they have practiced to honor the world before catastrophe? A society does not need writing to create meaning. It does not need cities to develop philosophy. It does not need agriculture to understand the stars. All it needs is memory and time. And humanity has always had both. Some myths even contain astronomical details so precise that they seem to encode observations rather than inventions. Stories about the Pleiades cluster, for example, appear in cultures worldwide and sometimes describe the constellation in ways that match its appearance thousands of years ago, before certain stars moved out of position. If true, this suggests that ancient storytellers were also ancient astronomers. Other myths speak of cycles of destruction and renewal, rising and falling knowledge, ages of light followed by ages of darkness. These could be symbolic, or they could reflect real cultural collapses, perhaps caused by climate instability, famine, or migration after the Great Melting. In every case, the myths act like shadows cast by forgotten events. And shadows, while not the object itself, can still reveal its shape. When we examine these global narratives not as fantasy but as encoded memory, a pattern emerges: humanity repeatedly remembers losing something more organized, more peaceful, or more advanced than what followed. Whether these memories describe literal societies, symbolic cycles, or emotional responses to catastrophe, they suggest that our ancestors were deeply aware of their own fragility. They also remind us that knowledge is vulnerable. A single flood can erase a community. A single drought can scatter a tribe. A single generation of forgetfulness can sever the chain of transmission. Yet even when knowledge is lost, echoes remain in the form of stories that outlive ruins. The storytellers of the deep past did not write their histories in stone. They carved them into the human imagination, trusting memory and repetition to carry them forward. And in doing so, they may have preserved the last whispers of societies erased by the Great Melting. As we continue this journey, we must treat these myths not as literal truth, but as windows, imperfect, symbolic, but illuminating. For in their patterns, in their shared motifs, and in their emotional resonance, they may give us the closest thing we have to eyewitness accounts of a forgotten age. When we speak of civilization, we often imagine something grand: towers of stone, sprawling markets, written laws, and ordered streets. But civilization does not begin with monuments. It begins with ideas. With repeated patterns of human behavior that become tradition, with cooperation that becomes organization, with shared belief that becomes culture. Long before the rise of Mesopotamia or Egypt, humans were already experimenting with these seeds of complexity. And in the quiet intervals between chaos and climate upheaval, some of those experiments may have blossomed into something far more sophisticated than we typically imagine. Picture a group of early humans living along the fertile edge of a river valley in the late Pleistocene. Their lives are no longer solely about survival. The environment, though unpredictable, is rich. Herds migrate through nearby plains. Fish gather in seasonal abundance. Plants sprout in predictable cycles. In such a place, people do not need to move constantly. They can stay a little longer each season. They can build shelters that do not need to be dismantled each time the group relocates. They can invest in learning the land, observing patterns, refining tools, and cultivating relationships. This is the foundation of civilization: permanence, even if only temporary, and continuity, even if fragile. From this stability emerges something extraordinary: the ability to plan beyond the immediate present. People begin to store food. They return to the same locations year after year. They carve stones not merely for survival but for meaning. They bury their dead with intention. They experiment with managing wild plants, pruning or watering them, perhaps unknowingly beginning the slow process of domestication. They trade tools, shells, pigments, or obsidian with neighboring groups, forming early networks of exchange. These are not simple behaviors. They are the beginnings of systems that require communication, coordination, and memory. If we strip away our modern expectations of what advanced looks like, we begin to see these early societies differently. Not as primitive wanderers, but as innovators discovering new forms of life. Complexity did not appear suddenly with the first cities; it accumulated slowly, like sediment layering over centuries of human experience. But archaeology gives us glimpses of something even more intriguing: signs of organization that seem to appear fully formed, without the long developmental stages we would expect. Take the construction of large communal structures: stone circles, aligned pillars, ritual enclosures. Building such sites requires planning, leadership, and a shared purpose strong enough to motivate hundreds of people to cooperate. This is not accidental complexity. It is intentional. It implies a cultural worldview that values symbolism, ritual, and collective identity. The people who built these structures may not have been civilized in the conventional sense, but they were certainly experimenting with civilization. Consider how they might have lived. Groups gather at certain times of year, perhaps tied to the movement of stars or the migration of animals. They bring food, tools, and gifts from distant regions. They exchange knowledge, conduct ceremonies, and reinforce social bonds. These gatherings become the centers of cultural evolution, places where new ideas spread, alliances form, and traditions strengthen. Even without writing, this level of coordination demands social structure. Elders, ritual specialists, skilled craftsmen, hunters, and negotiators would have distinct roles. Knowledge would be transmitted orally through stories, songs, or symbolic markings. A shared mythology would bind people emotionally, guiding their behavior and decision-making. This is not a chaotic or random society. It is an organized, deliberate, meaningful one. But civilization also requires something else: the ability to interact with the environment in transformative ways. Evidence from sites across the world suggests that early humans practiced environmental engineering long before full agriculture emerged. They controlled fire to shape landscapes, encouraging the growth of certain plants while reducing underbrush. They altered river pathways to improve fishing opportunities. They built stone-lined hearths and pits that may have been used for preservation or cooking in communal settings. Some archaeological findings even hint at early forms of proto-farming, fields where plants appear to have been selectively harvested or tended. This is not full domestication, but it is intentional manipulation of the environment. Combine environmental knowledge with ritual centers, social organization, and symbolic communication, and what emerges is a picture of societies operating at a level far above mere subsistence. Now imagine these experiments happening in pockets across the world. Human groups, isolated by distance but united by shared cognitive ability, developing innovations independently, perhaps reaching similar conclusions about the world, that stars map time. That rituals strengthen unity. That memory must be preserved. That nature can be shaped. That knowledge must be shared. Each group, in its own way, was taking steps toward civilization. And here lies the most fascinating possibility: what if some of these early experiments succeeded far better than we currently believe? What if one group developed a sustainable system of food gathering that allowed near-permanent settlement? What if another developed a symbolic language robust enough to record knowledge, even if not in written form we recognize today? What if a third developed complex trade networks that exchanged ideas and materials over hundreds of kilometers? These societies might not have had cities, but they could have had centers, nodes of cultural permanence. They might not have had writing, but they could have had symbols, calendars, and oral genealogies. They might not have had metallurgy, but they could have had stoneworking techniques so refined that they required apprenticeship and specialization. Such a culture would not leave behind skyscrapers or metal tools. But it might leave behind astronomical alignments, ritual architecture, genetic signatures, or myths that echo forward through time. And if their settlements were built along coastlines, now drowned beneath the oceans, they may have left nothing visible at all. In this sense, the first experiments with civilization may have been far more successful than we realize. They may have produced societies that were stable, knowledgeable, and spiritually rich, societies that understood the land, the sky, and the rhythms of life with an intimacy modern humans often lack. Their success would not necessarily be measured by technological advancement. It might be measured by harmony, organization, and resilience. And perhaps some of these societies lasted for centuries before being undone by climate shifts, resource changes, or catastrophic events tied to the Great Melting. If so, then the ruins of their achievements are not lost, they were simply never built of materials strong enough to survive to our time. Their true legacy lies in the stories that survived, in the symbols carved with deliberate intention, and in the occasional archaeological anomaly that challenges our neatly constructed timelines. These early experiments did not vanish. They transformed. They flowed into the cultures that followed, merging with new ideas and new environments, leaving echoes in ritual practices, social structures, and mythic memories. Civilization, as we understand it today, may not be humanity's first attempt, but merely the one that endured long enough to be recorded. While stones crumble, wood rots, and coastlines drown beneath rising seas, there is one archive that endures in a different way, hidden not in the earth, but in us. Human DNA carries memories older than any myth, older than any artifact, older even than many landscapes themselves. Within its twisting spirals lie echoes of migrations, interbreeding events, population collapses, and lost lineages that once walked the world beside us. If physical evidence of forgotten societies has vanished, the genetic record may still preserve their shadows. In the last 2 decades, advances in genetics have revealed a truth far stranger than anything archaeology had predicted: humanity's past is not a simple line of descent. It is a tangled web of interactions with groups we did not know existed until their genetic traces appeared in our cells. The Neanderthals were the first surprise, but not the last. The Denisovans, an entirely separate human lineage, were discovered almost by accident, identified not through skeletons but through DNA extracted from a single finger bone in a Siberian cave. That tiny bone reshaped our understanding of the human story. It revealed that modern humans interbred with other intelligent groups that left no monumental architecture, no surviving tools, no art that we can definitively identify. Their existence lived only in our genetic code, until technology made it visible again. What else might be hidden there? Genetic studies have revealed ghost populations, ancient human groups that interbred with our ancestors but left no known fossils or physical remains. We do not know their names, their appearance, or the nature of their societies. We know only that they existed, because their DNA appears in fragments scattered across the genomes of people living today. These ghost populations raise a profound question: how many human groups lived, thrived, and disappeared without leaving clear archaeological evidence? And if entire branches of humanity can vanish so completely that only microscopic traces survive, what does that say about the fragility of early cultures and the historical record? The genetic record also shows signs of dramatic population bottlenecks, periods when the number of humans shrank drastically before expanding again. These bottlenecks could have been caused by pandemics, volcanic eruptions, rapid climate shifts, or catastrophic floods during the Great Melting. Each bottleneck represents a moment when knowledge, culture, and memory were at risk of extinction. A society might have reached a level of complexity, only to lose most of its population in a disaster, leaving survivors scattered and struggling to rebuild. Such events could erase centuries of cultural development in a single generation. Even more intriguing are the genetic signatures that imply migrations predating what archaeology currently supports. Human groups appear to have moved into certain regions thousands of years earlier than previously thought, or in numbers that suggest organized travel rather than random wandering. This hints at forms of social structure advanced enough to coordinate long-distance journeys that may have required navigation techniques, leadership, and planning. But genetics also reveals another kind of ghost: knowledge itself. Inherited traits do not only include physical characteristics. They include adaptations, metabolic, immunological, and neurological, that reflect the lifestyles of ancient groups. In some populations, there are signs of dietary shifts long before agriculture, implying that people may have engaged in selective foraging or proto-farming. In others, genetic markers suggest adaptation to sedentary life, even when no archaeological evidence of permanent settlements exists for that time period. These biological clues whisper possibilities. They suggest that ancient humans may have lived in ways that are not reflected accurately in the surviving material record, ways more complex, stable, or structured than we assume. But the most haunting question arises from what genetics doesn't show. There are gaps in the genetic record, periods where populations seem to vanish from certain regions, only to reappear later with different genetic compositions. These gaps could indicate catastrophic events, mass migrations, or the disappearance of entire cultural groups. In some cases, genetics shows that a population once thrived in an area, but archaeology finds almost nothing. How do we reconcile these contradictions? One explanation is that we simply haven't found the sites yet, perhaps because they lie beneath oceans or deep beneath sediment. Another explanation is that early cultures left behind materials that did not endure. A third, more provocative possibility is that some societies were small but highly organized, with knowledge encoded in oral tradition rather than physical structures. Such societies could rise and fall with little archaeological footprint, yet leave genetic marks that persist for thousands of years. And then there is the possibility difficult to ignore, that some early populations were wiped out entirely, leaving no descendants to carry their genetic signatures forward. If an advanced culture existed but was isolated, small in number, or centered in a region devastated by climate change, its people could have vanished without contributing significantly to the gene pool. Their knowledge, rituals, and accomplishments would disappear with them, leaving no trace except perhaps faint echoes in the myths of surviving groups. The genetic record is a reminder of how incomplete our understanding truly is. We are missing entire branches of the human story, not because the people were insignificant, but because time is ruthless. Bones dissolve. Artifacts vanish. Landscapes shift. But DNA, carried quietly through generations, preserves hints of these lost chapters. It is tempting to imagine that if early advanced societies existed, they would surely leave behind overwhelming evidence, cities, tools, monuments. But genetics teaches us humility. Even whole human species can vanish without leaving recognizable remains. Even significant population events can disappear from the archaeological record. Even major cultural shifts can leave behind no physical trace. And yet, their echoes remain in us. Every cell in our bodies carries the memory of ancient encounters, reminders that humanity's past is not linear, not simple, and certainly not fully uncovered. The ghosts in the genetic record tell us that entire worlds may have existed, worlds now invisible, erased not by conspiracy or mystery but by the natural forces of time and survival. If we want to understand the possibility of a forgotten advanced culture, we must be willing to learn from these genetic ghosts. They show us that absence of evidence does not mean absence of existence. They show us how easily entire peoples can disappear. And most importantly, they show us that the story of humanity is far older, far more complex, and far more mysterious than our surviving ruins suggest. When we look into the distant past, we do so through a keyhole carved by time. What survives is not a representative sample of ancient life, it is the rare exception. The archaeological record is not a complete archive, it is a collection of accidents. Objects that happen to land in conditions favorable to preservation. Materials that resisted decay purely by chance. Landscapes that escaped erosion, flood, or tectonic shift. Everything else, almost everything, has vanished. It is difficult to grasp the scale of this loss. Imagine the entire modern world suddenly abandoned. Our cities would collapse within centuries. Highways would crumble, metal would rust into flakes, books would disintegrate into pulp. In 1,000 years, forests would reclaim skyscrapers. In 10,000 years, only a few stone structures might remain. And in 20,000 years, even those might be buried beneath shifting soils or scraped away by glaciers. Now imagine the same process happening to societies that built with wood, clay, plant fibers, bone, and hides, materials infinitely more fragile than steel or concrete. Their entire existence could disappear without leaving a single recognizable trace. This is the central challenge of deep prehistory: survival is not the default. Preservation is the anomaly. Organic materials, wooden homes, woven baskets, leather containers, rope, textiles, early writing surfaces, are the first to vanish. Unless they were protected by extremely dry caves, frozen environments, or oxygen-free mud, they decay completely. Even tools made of stone can fail us. A chipped tool might survive, but any structure built from rocks, if exposed to thousands of years of rain, vegetation, and frost, can break down until it appears indistinguishable from natural debris. Entire settlements could crumble into the earth until they look like nothing more than a random scatter of pebbles. Even monumental stone architecture is vulnerable. Earthquakes topple walls. Floods scatter foundations. Sandstorms bury sites beneath dunes. Vegetation pulls apart structures as roots push through cracks. 1,000 years is enough to erase clarity, 10,000 can erase identity, 20,000 can erase existence. And yet we often reason as though absence of evidence equals absence of activity. We assume that if a society had developed early complexity, whether in ritual, trade, symbolic thought, or environmental engineering, we would find clear remains. But this assumption only holds if that society built in ways that survive. What if their ceremonial structures were made of wood instead of stone? What if their settlements were built on coastlines now underwater? What if their tools were crafted from organic materials that left no trace? What if their symbolic communication system relied on carvings in wood, pigments on bark, or knotted textiles long since decomposed? The truth is simple. Early complexity does not require durable materials, and durable materials do not guarantee survival. To understand how little survives, consider the mathematical rarity of preservation. Archaeologists estimate that only a tiny fraction, perhaps one or less, of ancient human activity falls within ideal preservation contexts. And of that one, only a fraction is found. The deep ocean floor is largely unexplored. Jungles hide ruins under dense vegetation. Deserts bury artifacts beneath meters of shifting sand. Even in well-studied regions, we have excavated only a small percentage of the land. It is humbling to realize that our knowledge of prehistory rests on a sliver of surviving evidence from a world that was infinitely richer and more complex than the fragments suggest. Then there is the problem of erosion, not just physical erosion, but temporal erosion. A site may have existed for centuries, only to be destroyed by a single natural event. A flood can bury a settlement under 10 meters of sediment, effectively sealing it for eternity. A volcanic eruption can obliterate an entire cultural landscape. A rising sea can swallow a coastline without leaving any artifacts within reach of divers or archaeologists. We can see this erasure even in relatively recent history. Entire medieval cities have disappeared beneath river mud. Viking settlements on the North American coast remain uncertain despite being only 1,000 years old. Indigenous Australian rock art, tens of thousands of years old, is sometimes the only surviving evidence of cultures that left no structures behind. If stone carvings struggle to survive, what hope is there for the delicate materials used by early humans? This leads us to a critical question. What if the societies of the deep past built their lives around materials that were never meant to withstand the weight of 10,000 years? Early humans were intimately connected to nature. They used wood for frames, thatch for roofs, clay for walls, reeds for mats, animal skins for coverings, and fibers for tools. Even their ceremonial items, masks, totems, woven garments, were made from organic matter. Such societies could have been richly expressive, highly organized, and filled with cultural complexity yet leave almost nothing for us to discover today. Even the written word, if it existed in some early symbolic form, may have been inscribed on perishable surfaces, bark, leather, or cloth. The earliest known writing systems appear suddenly and fully formed, as if emerging from nothing. But perhaps they had precursors. Perhaps experimental forms of proto-writing existed long before, only on materials too fragile to survive. The limits of what survives shape the limits of what we believe. Archaeology is not just the science of what we find, but the science of what time allows us to find. Thus, when we consider the possibility of a forgotten advanced culture, we must remember that its absence in the archaeological record is not surprising, it is expected. A small, interconnected society living near coastlines, building with organic materials, and experiencing catastrophic environmental change could vanish completely within a few centuries. The Earth has erased far more than it has preserved. And perhaps the most sobering realization is this: even our own civilization, if erased today, might leave behind less evidence than we imagine. In the end, the limits of what survives force us to expand the limits of our imagination. They remind us that the story we see is not the whole story. It is the surviving fragment of a much larger, deeper, richer human experience, an experience shaped as much by loss as by discovery. To understand the possibility of an early advanced culture, we must first step into the world of the people who lived through the final breaths of the Ice Age, not as abstractions in textbooks, but as human beings with routines, traditions, hopes, and fears. These were not faceless silhouettes wandering through frozen landscapes. They were families, storytellers, observers, inventors, and dreamers. They were hunters, yes, but they were also gardeners of wild landscapes and astronomers of the open sky, experimenting with forms of knowledge far deeper than we often imagine. Picture an early settlement along a river fed by melting glaciers. Wooden shelters reinforced with animal hides form a semicircle around a communal hearth. Smoke drifts into the evening air, carrying the scent of roasting meat and herbs. Children gather stones to line cooking pits. Elders carve tools from bone with practiced precision. Women and men tend to tasks without strict division, everyone contributing as needed. Cooperation was not just a virtue, it was survival. But this scene is not primitive. It is sophisticated in ways that archaeology struggles to measure. As hunters, these people knew the landscape intimately. They read tracks in the soil as though they were written language. They understood the migratory patterns of animals over hundreds of kilometers. They could predict a herd's direction from a single displaced branch or a faint scent carried on the wind. They worked together in coordinated strategies, driving animals toward natural traps, using decoys, or tracking for days until the ideal moment arrived. This required planning, communication, and shared leadership. Their hunting tools reflected deep knowledge, finely crafted stone points shaped for specific tasks, spears weighted for distance or force, knives capable of delicate work. Nothing was random. Every piece of stone was struck with intention, each angle carefully understood. This was engineering, not in metal, but in stone. Yet they were not only hunters. They were gardeners long before the first agricultural societies emerged. Across the world, early humans managed landscapes intentionally. They burned patches of land to encourage the growth of certain plants. They scattered seeds from wild grains along riverbanks, returning each year to harvest the richest patches. They transplanted tubers and roots closer to their settlements. They learned which plants grew best in shade, which in sun, which required fire to germinate, which needed specific soil types. This was not formal farming, but it was the beginning of agriculture, landscape management born from observation and experimentation over generations. A society practicing such early gardening would have a more stable food supply, allowing for longer stays in one place. And with stability comes something even more important: time. Time to think, to observe, to innovate, to create. And this is where another dimension of their intelligence revealed itself: their relationship with the sky. With no artificial light and no distractions of modern life, the night sky was a constant companion. The stars were not distant objects but living markers of time and season. People noticed patterns: how certain stars rose just before the fish returned to the river, how the moon's cycle aligned with plant growth, how the solstices brought changes in wind and temperature. From these observations emerged the first astronomers. They tracked the phases of the moon with carved bones marked in sequences. They oriented their shelters to catch the first morning light of solstice. They gathered on high ground to watch the stars shift across the seasons. In some regions, they built stone structures aligned with celestial events, long before writing or cities appeared. This was not accidental. It was deliberate, repeated, and meaningful. It required memory and tradition, passed through generations. It required leaders, teachers, and ritual keepers, roles that hint at early forms of social structure. Imagine these astronomers explaining the sky to children gathered around a fire. They point to the Pleiades and recount stories older than memory. They trace lines between stars, forming animals, heroes, or spirits that guide migration routes. They know when to move, when to plant, when to gather, when to prepare for winter. In this sense, astronomy was not an academic pursuit, it was a survival tool, a calendar encoded in stories and symbols. But with this knowledge comes something deeper: reflection. When a group is no longer consumed solely by survival, it begins to ask why. Why do seasons change? Why do stars move? Why do animals migrate? Why does the river rise and fall? These questions do not lead immediately to science, but they lead to thought, to philosophy, to early frameworks for understanding the world. And so, these early humans, hunters, gardeners, astronomers, were also philosophers. They carved symbols on stone not merely as decoration, but as meaning. Spirals representing cycles of life. Lines marking pathways of stars. Animals portrayed with reverence, suggesting spiritual significance rather than mere hunting trophies. They held rituals to honor the forces of nature, to remember ancestors, to unite communities. Even their tools could carry symbolism. A perfectly crafted spear might represent lineage, mastery, or status. A necklace made of shells carried hundreds of kilometers could be a sign of connection to distant groups. These were expressions of identity, belonging, and communication. Imagine them gathered during a full moon, sharing stories of creation, destruction, and renewal. Imagine them performing rituals that synchronized with natural cycles, reinforcing social harmony. These moments shaped their culture every bit as much as their hunting or gardening. Yet much of this complexity is invisible in the archaeological record. Organic materials decay, stories vanish, rituals leave little trace. What survives, stone tools, scattered bones, occasional carvings, represents only a sliver of their lived experience. But when we reimagine these people as whole humans, resourceful, observant, intelligent, emotional, we begin to see the outline of what an early advanced culture might look like. Not a city of stone, but a network of knowledge. Not large-scale agriculture, but intentional landscape management. Not written records, but rich oral traditions and astronomical understanding. Their advancement was subtle, woven into daily life rather than displayed in monumental architecture. It was a way of living that balanced innovation with harmony, adaptation with stability, survival with meaning. If such societies existed along ancient coasts or fertile valleys now lost beneath the sea, their achievements would be almost entirely erased. But their influence may echo in the rituals, myths, and cultural practices of later civilizations, echoes we can still hear if we listen carefully. In the end, these early humans were not wandering primitives. They were thinkers and creators, scientists and artists, caretakers of land and caretakers of memory. They lived in a world that demanded ingenuity and rewarded insight. And in the spaces between hunting, gardening, and stargazing, they may have taken the first steps toward forms of civilization we have yet to fully understand. When we imagine early humans, we often picture a single line of development, one culture evolving into the next, gradually building toward the civilizations we recognize today. But the truth is far more complex. The Earth of 10 to 15,000 years ago was not unified by a single trajectory. It was a mosaic of worlds, each isolated by oceans, mountains, and vast stretches of wilderness. In these scattered pockets of humanity, ideas flickered into existence like sparks, some glowing brightly for centuries, others extinguished before they had a chance to spread. This was a planet not of one early culture, but of many independent experiments in human potential. Across the Japanese archipelago, the Jomon people were creating pottery as early as 14,000 BCE, long before agriculture took root in most parts of the world. Their pottery was not crude, it was intricate, artistic, intentionally designed. They decorated vessels with swirling patterns and chord-marked textures that hint at a complex aesthetic tradition. And they were not farmers, they were hunter-gatherers who chose to settle seasonally, forming semi-permanent communities along coastlines rich with resources. Why did pottery flourish here but not elsewhere? Because the spark of innovation ignited in a specific environment, among a specific group of people, under specific conditions that allowed them to experiment and refine. On the other side of the world, in the Andean regions of South America, ancient peoples were developing early forms of environmental engineering, terracing hillsides, managing water flows, experimenting with high-altitude agriculture long before the Inca civilization arose. Their ancestors mapped microclimates, understood the behavior of mountain winds, and adapted to extreme altitudes in ways modern societies still struggle to comprehend. These were not primitive populations. They were innovators shaped by their landscapes. Meanwhile, indigenous Australians, whose cultural traditions stretch back tens of thousands of years, developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, mapping the stars with precision and embedding this understanding into their stories, songs, and ceremonies. They tracked eclipses, solstices, and seasonal changes, passing this knowledge through oral tradition so precisely that modern astronomers have been able to decode specific celestial references within ancient narratives. These distant groups never met. They never exchanged ideas. Yet each developed unique forms of complexity shaped by their environment, their needs, and their worldview. This is the essence of human innovation. It emerges wherever people have the stability, knowledge, and desire to explore beyond immediate survival. But isolation also means vulnerability. A culture that develops a powerful idea, whether it be pottery, astronomy, proto-agriculture, or ritual architecture, can lose it just as quickly if famine, flood, or migration disrupts the continuity of knowledge. Without writing, without dense populations, without long-term stability, ideas remain fragile. They can spread within a region but fail to jump across vast distances. A society might be on the cusp of developing a major advancement, only to retreat under environmental pressure or be forced to move, leaving the spark behind. This raises an intriguing question: what if one of these isolated sparks grew into a flame, becoming an advanced culture by prehistoric standards, but existed in a place where the evidence has since been erased? Imagine a coastal group living along what is now a drowned continental shelf. They develop seasonal settlements, symbolic traditions, complex trade networks, and perhaps even a stable food production strategy. Over generations, they refine their knowledge. They chart the stars. They manage landscapes. They create ritual sites with materials that do not survive underwater. Their culture thrives, but in isolation. Then the great melting arrives. Seas rise. Storms intensify. Shorelines retreat. The people scatter inland, carrying memories but leaving structures behind. Those structures, built near ancient shores, vanish beneath rising oceans. Within a few centuries, their homeland is gone. Their descendants, forced to adapt to new conditions, abandon certain practices or lose specific knowledge. What remains? Only a faint echo in myth, a genetic signature diluted over millennia, a few anomalous artifacts discovered far from their original context. This is why isolation matters. The world of early humanity was not interconnected. Trade routes existed, but they were not global. Knowledge did not spread easily across continents. When a group developed something remarkable, it remained confined to their territory unless they migrated or encountered others, events that were unpredictable and often driven by desperation rather than choice. Isolation created diversity, but it also created silence. Each group carried its own worldview, its own rituals, its own technologies. Some carved stone. Others shaped clay. Some studied the sky. Others shaped the earth. Some created stable settlements, while others moved with the seasons. There was no single path to complexity. Instead, there were thousands of paths, each shaped by climate, culture, landscape, and chance. And this diversity makes it entirely plausible that a culture more advanced than its neighbors could emerge in isolation, thrive for generations, and then disappear without widespread influence. Not because it was mythical. Not because it was technologically unimaginable. But because it was alone. A spark can light a fire, but only if conditions allow it to spread. Humanity in the late Pleistocene and early Holocene was still a species in motion, moving, adapting, surviving. The world itself was unstable. Floods, droughts, ecosystem changes, and resource scarcity forced constant reinvention. Under such conditions, a flourishing culture might rise quickly, but could also fade rapidly if environmental or social pressures overwhelmed it. We must also remember that even the most remarkable cultures leave little evidence if their material culture was organic. A community of 1,000 people living in wooden structures along an ancient coastline could vanish completely. Their pottery might break. Their carvings might erode. Their tools might scatter. Their stories might change as they adapt to new lands. And yet, for centuries, they may have lived in a way that felt advanced to them, organized, symbolic, spiritual, and deeply knowledgeable. When we look at the scattered sparks across the prehistoric world, the Jaman artists, the Andean engineers, the Aboriginal astronomers, we see what humans are capable of when given time and stability. But we also see how fragile these sparks are when isolated. A world of isolated societies means a world of lost stories. For every spark that survived into history, countless others may have ignited and faded, leaving only the faintest glow in the archaeological record, if any at all. And so, when we ask whether an advanced culture could have existed 10,000 years ago, we must consider that it would not need to be global. It could have been one of these isolated sparks, brief, brilliant, and ultimately consumed by the shifting world around it. A forgotten light in a landscape of rising seas and restless skies. For most of human existence, the Earth has been both a generous provider and an unpredictable threat. But there were moments, rare, violent, world-shaping moments, when the planet shifted so dramatically that no culture, no matter how resilient or advanced, could stand against it. These were the moments when the Earth seemed to turn against its inhabitants, unleashing forces that reshaped continents, drowned coastlines, altered climates, and erased entire ways of life. To imagine what might have happened to a forgotten ancient culture, we must first understand the scale of these catastrophes, events powerful enough to erase evidence, scatter survivors, and transform landscapes so completely that they become unrecognizable to later generations. One of the most profound of these events unfolded near the end of the last ice age, around 12,800 years ago. The world had been warming, glaciers retreating, ecosystems shifting. Then, abruptly, the climate snapped back toward glacial conditions in an episode known as the Younger Dryas. Temperatures plummeted within decades. Species vanished. Rivers froze. Regions that had been habitable were thrust back into harsh, wintry environments. But the cause of this sudden cooling remains one of the greatest mysteries in paleoclimatology. Some scientists propose that an enormous influx of glacial meltwater poured into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents and triggering a global cold spell. Others suggest the possibility of a cosmic impact, a fragmented comet or meteor exploding in the atmosphere, igniting massive wildfires, choking the skies with soot, and plunging the Earth into darkness. If such an event occurred, it would have been devastating beyond our imagination: shockwaves flattening forests, firestorms sweeping across continents, animals fleeing or perishing in burning plains. For humans alive at the time, it would have felt like the wrath of the heavens, a sudden, inexplicable collapse of the world they knew. And then, almost as suddenly as it began, the Younger Dryas ended. Temperatures rose sharply. Ice sheets melted at terrifying speed. Sea levels surged. Rivers overflowed. Glacial lakes burst through their icy boundaries, releasing megafloods that carved canyons and reshaped the land in a matter of hours. If a culture had been living along the low-lying coasts or river valleys during this period, it could have been obliterated in a single season. Imagine a settlement of early humans, organized, knowledgeable, perhaps practicing ritual, tracking the stars, tending managed landscapes. They built their homes along what was then the coastline, unaware that the sea would soon rise by hundreds of feet. Suddenly the ocean surges inland, swallowing the land with unstoppable force. Waves tear apart dwellings, scatter tools, uproot trees. People flee inland, carrying only what they can hold. Their ritual centers, their meeting places, their symbolic carvings, all vanish beneath the rising waters. To the survivors, it would feel like the world itself had turned hostile. But water was not the only threat. Catastrophic volcanic eruptions, like the Toba eruption tens of thousands of years earlier, could blanket entire regions in ash. Ash clouds block sunlight, collapsing ecosystems. Crops fail before they begin. Animals starve. People migrate in desperation, abandoning traditions, tools, and rituals. In mountainous regions, pyroclastic flows would have erased everything in their path. Settlements, forests, and river systems could be buried under meters of volcanic debris. A thriving community could vanish so completely that, without survivors to tell the story, future generations would never know it existed. There were earthquakes too, massive ones. Entire landscapes lifted or sank. Rivers diverted. Coastal plains submerged. Tectonic shifts split land into islands or joined islands into continents. In such moments, humans had no ability to preserve their cultural landmarks. Even stone structures could crumble or be swallowed by the earth. And then there were the megastorms. Climate instability at the end of the Ice Age fueled atmospheric chaos. Superstorms with winds stronger than any in recorded history could have struck coastal settlements. Storm surges could penetrate dozens of kilometers inland. Homes built of wood and hide would be torn apart. Ritual sites would be desecrated by wind and water. Even the strongest of communities would be forced to abandon their traditions and flee. If an early advanced society existed, something small, fragile, but sophisticated, it would have faced these disasters with the same vulnerability as everyone else. Survival would require movement. Movement would disrupt continuity. Knowledge encoded in oral tradition could be lost if the storytellers perished. Skills requiring long apprenticeship could vanish if craftspeople scattered. Rituals that depended on specific locations, stone circles, caves, sacred groves, would fade if those places were destroyed or left behind. And then, in the aftermath of catastrophe, a tragic irony emerges: survivors prioritize survival, not preservation. Their tools become simpler. Their rituals more pragmatic. Their focus narrows to food, shelter, and safety. Over generations, the memory of what once was would fade, not out of neglect, but out of necessity. A society could devolve in complexity even as its people remained biologically identical to us. Knowledge can collapse far faster than it can be built. The Earth, in these transformative centuries, was not a stable cradle for civilization. It was a relentless force of change. Whatever early advancements existed, they were constantly at risk. A society that flourished in one era could be erased in the next. Even today, we see how fragile civilizations are. Floods can destroy cities. Earthquakes can erase entire communities. Volcanoes can make fertile regions uninhabitable. And these events occur within the framework of a global civilization with immense technological capability. Now imagine humans facing such disasters without metal, without writing, without long-distance communication. Imagine their vulnerability. Imagine their fear. Imagine their loss. If a forgotten society had risen, structured, ritualistic, astronomical, symbolic, it could have been undone by a single century of catastrophe. The Great Melting, the Younger Dryas, volcanic eruptions, megafloods, and global storms were not isolated incidents. They formed a chain of upheavals that reshaped the Earth between 13,000 and 8,000 BCE. A chain long enough to erase almost everything. And so, when we consider the question at the heart of this documentary, whether an advanced culture could have existed 10,000 years ago, we must confront a sobering truth: even if it did, the Earth itself may have destroyed nearly all traces of it. Yet something else remains, something more powerful than stone or wood: the stories passed through generations, the symbols carved on rock walls, the global myths of floods and lost worlds. These echoes suggest that humanity has survived worlds that no longer exist, and that perhaps some of what we have forgotten was once known, cherished, and then consumed by catastrophe. Every civilization, no matter how great, stands on a fragile threshold. It exists only as long as memory holds, as long as knowledge is passed from one generation to the next, as long as people stay connected to the land and to each other. But when a culture faces disruption, displacement, or disaster, there comes a moment where continuity breaks. A moment where the thread of identity snaps. This moment, the instant when a society becomes invisible to the future, is what we call the vanishing point. To imagine how an early advanced culture might have disappeared, we must step into that moment as though we were living through it. Not as scholars with hindsight, but as human beings standing at the crossroads of survival and loss. Picture a community that has flourished for generations. They have their rituals, their seasonal gatherings, their ways of reading the stars, their unspoken rules of cooperation. They live along a fertile coastline or a river valley that has nourished them for centuries. Their structures are modest but meaningful. Their knowledge is vast but carried in memory rather than stone. Their society, while small by modern standards, is stable, cohesive, and rich with tradition. Then the world begins to change. Perhaps the sea rises faster than anyone anticipated. Or a drought withers the land. Or a flood destroys the settlement. Perhaps storms become more frequent. Perhaps game animals migrate away. Perhaps famine spreads. Or perhaps it is something more subtle, internal conflict, resource scarcity, or a shift in leadership that fractures the community from within. Whatever the cause, the result is the same: people begin to move. At first, the migration is temporary, meant only to escape danger. But as conditions worsen, temporary becomes permanent. Families pack what little they can carry: tools, blankets, symbolic objects, seeds gathered from familiar fields. They abandon homes built by their ancestors. They leave behind sacred sites they once believed would stand forever. And with each step they take away from their homeland, something is lost. A child grows up never learning the songs of her ancestors because the elders who knew them did not survive the journey. A ritual no longer makes sense because its meaning was tied to a place now submerged beneath the sea. A technique for cultivating wild plants fades because the new land has different soil, different seasons, different challenges. A carving style disappears because the stone available in the old territory no longer exists in the new. Knowledge unanchored to place begins to unravel. Within a few decades, an entire tradition can wither. Within a century, a culture can break apart into fragments. Some settle in different regions. Some merge with neighboring groups. Some perish in unfamiliar lands. Stories shift. Names are forgotten. Symbols lose meaning. The once cohesive identity dissolves into the vast tapestry of humanity. To archaeologists thousands of years later, the society will appear to vanish suddenly, mysteriously, without explanation. But to the people living through it, the vanishing was not sudden at all. It was a slow, painful erosion, of home, of memory, of certainty. This is the human side of cultural collapse. And it is easy to underestimate how quickly it can happen. Linguists know that languages can disappear in just 2 or 3 generations. Anthropologists know that rituals dissolve when the people who practice them scatter. Knowledge that required long apprenticeship, a technique for crafting tools, weaving nets, tending wild crops, can be lost forever if only a handful of experts perish. Even today, with our global networks and technological archives, cultures vanish within decades due to displacement, assimilation, or forced migration. Now imagine a small prehistoric community with no written records, no metal tools, no stable settlements, only memory. Their entire history could vanish in the blink of an archaeological eye. The vanishing point is not defined by the final breath of a culture, but by the moment its identity becomes untraceable. Imagine the last elder of such a society, carrying memories that no one else knows. Stories of the coast before it sank. Knowledge of the stars that guided ancestors across the plains. Rituals tied to a hill that no longer exists. She might sit beside a fire, surrounded by children who speak a blended language, who have different customs, who do not understand why she mourns a place they have never seen. When she dies, a world dies with her. The vanishing point is silent. It leaves no ruins, no monuments, no inscriptions. It is a cultural disappearance rather than a physical one. The people survive, but the worldview that shaped them is lost. And yet, echoes sometimes endure. Part of a myth survives, though stripped of context. A carving style appears in a region far from where it originated. A genetic marker travels across continents without any artifacts to explain its journey. A ritual gesture persists even when no one remembers what it once meant. These are the faint fingerprints of vanished cultures, so subtle that only careful study can reveal them. If an advanced early society existed, its vanishing point may have come from a combination of environmental catastrophe and gradual cultural erosion. Floods may have displaced them. Climate change may have altered their food sources. Disease or conflict may have weakened them. Migration may have scattered their knowledge. In the end, their people would blend with others, their identity dissolving into a larger human story. Their achievements might survive only as faint myths, stories of golden ages, lost lands, or ancestors who knew secrets now forgotten. And so, when we search for evidence of such a society, we face a profound challenge. We are not searching for ruins, but for absences. For gaps in tradition. For unexplained anomalies. For echoes in places where silence should be. The vanishing point teaches us humility. It reminds us that the past is not defined solely by what remains, but by what has been lost. And it invites us to imagine how many worlds may have risen and fallen long before ours, worlds erased not by failure, but by forces too great for fragile human continuity to withstand. Sometimes the most important evidence is not hidden in remote caves or buried beneath the ocean, it sits quietly in the open, overlooked because it does not fit our expectations. We assume ancient complexity must look like pyramids or scripts carved into stone. But what if early sophistication expressed itself in ways far more subtle? What if the traces of a forgotten culture lie not in grand monuments, but in patterns, alignments, symbols, and anomalies that we have not yet learned to interpret? Across the world, scattered like breadcrumbs through deep time, are clues that suggest humans were pushing the boundaries of knowledge long before recorded civilization began. These clues do not form a complete picture, but when viewed together, they hint at a level of intentionality and understanding that challenges mainstream assumptions. Start with the oldest clue of all, alignment with the heavens. Long before the rise of cities, ancient people were charting the sky with astonishing accuracy. At Göbekli Tepe, some of the stone pillars appear to align with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, or star clusters that held significance in the ancient world. These alignments are not accidental. They require long-term observation, seasonal tracking, and a cultural system capable of passing down astronomical knowledge. In other regions, stone circles and standing stones, often dismissed as ritual objects, may have been early calendars. A single misplaced stone could ruin an alignment, yet these ancient builders placed them with precision. They knew the cycle of the sun. They watched the moon's 18-6-year nodal cycle. Some even mapped the heliacal rising of stars like Sirius or the Pleiades, events that later civilizations used to predict floods, seasons, and migrations. These alignments tell us something profound. Ancient people did not merely observe the sky, they studied it. But astronomy is only one piece of the puzzle. Consider the mysterious practice of sourcing materials from distant locations. At archaeological sites around the world, we find stones, shells, pigments, and minerals transported from hundreds of kilometers away. Tools made of obsidian, a volcanic glass with razor-sharp edges, traveled across vast regions despite being found in only a few isolated volcanic zones. This suggests trade networks far older than once believed. To move materials across such distances, people needed coordination, communication, and a shared system of value. They needed meeting places, alliances, and consistent routes. They needed trust. Trade is not an activity of isolated tribes, it is a marker of cultural complexity. Then there are the symbols, those quiet carvings that appear in caves, on stones, or etched into bone. Lines, grids, animals, spirals, hands, abstract shapes. For decades, these symbols were interpreted as simple artistic expressions. But recent research has shown that some of these markings follow patterns too consistent to be accidental. Some appear to track lunar cycles. Some appear to represent migration routes of prey animals. Some may represent early attempts at recording information, a precursor not to writing as we know it, but to symbolic communication capable of preserving knowledge. These symbols were not random doodles. They were ideas preserved in stone. We also see unexpected leaps in engineering, techniques that seem out of place for their time. Consider the ancient wells discovered in parts of the Levant, dating back more than 10,000 years. Their construction required precise knowledge of groundwater, understanding of rock structure, and the ability to coordinate labor. Yet according to traditional timelines, well digging of this complexity should not appear until thousands of years later. Or consider the enigmatic stone bowls and grinding slabs from the same era, carved with astonishing smoothness, symmetry, and skill. These are not crude implements, they are artful, deliberate, and standardized. Why would a simple hunter-gatherer society invest so much time in perfecting such objects? Perhaps because they were not so simple after all. Another clue lies in the ritual landscapes, areas where early humans gathered repeatedly for purposes beyond survival. These sites often include carved stones, fireplaces arranged geometrically, or mounds built from earth transported by human hands. The scale of these constructions implies communal effort and shared purpose. Ritual is a powerful indicator of culture. It suggests belief systems, leadership structures, and social organization. It suggests a worldview in which people sought meaning beyond daily life. Even the remnants of early feasting tell a story. At some ancient sites, archaeologists have found evidence of massive communal meals, feasts too large to be accidental. These gatherings required coordination, planning, and perhaps even invitations sent across regions. Such events reinforce social bonds and distribute knowledge. In such gatherings, ideas could spread. Techniques could be shared. Rituals could be standardized. Alliances could be formed. These are the building blocks of civilization. And yet, these clues are scattered and subtle because the materials used by early societies did not survive. If they built wooden structures, those structures decomposed. If they created art from plant fibers, it vanished. If they had proto-writing on bark or leather, no trace remains. Even their stone structures, if smaller or less protected, could erode into unrecognizable fragments over millennia. This is why the surviving clues appear enigmatic. They are the pieces of a puzzle whose edges have been eaten away by time. But the real question is this: why do these clues appear so early, so suddenly, and so globally, if humans were supposedly simple and uniform during that era? The answer may be that pockets of innovation were thriving independently, creating sparks of complexity across the prehistoric world. Some sparks faded. Others spread. Some left faint traces. Others, perhaps, were lost entirely. But the clues that remain, astronomical alignments, early trade networks, symbolic communication, environmental engineering, ritual centers, suggest a deeper story. A story in which humans were not passively waiting for agriculture to invent civilization, but actively experimenting with complexity wherever conditions allowed. Perhaps one of these experiments succeeded in ways we have not yet imagined. Perhaps an early advanced culture developed a nuanced understanding of the environment, astronomy, social organization, and ritual, a culture that functioned not as a proto-civilization, but as a complete system in its own right. If so, its remains would be subtle. Its memory would be fragile. And its disappearance could be complete if the earth turned against it or if its people scattered. But its traces, faint, fragmented, yet persistent, may still lie in plain sight, waiting for us to recognize them. For thousands of years, humanity walked past the silent stones and forgotten landscapes of the ancient world without understanding their meaning. We lived atop the ruins of lost eras without realizing they were ruins. We sailed over drowned coastlines, built cities near buried valleys, and plowed fields above prehistoric settlements, never imagining what lay beneath. But in recent decades, something extraordinary has begun to happen. The tools of modern science, combined with a renewed hunger to understand our origins, have sparked a new age of discovery. It is a rebirth of curiosity, one powerful enough to illuminate chapters of human history once believed forever lost. This renaissance did not emerge all at once. It grew from small breakthroughs, an unexpected artifact here, a surprising excavation there. A carved stone discovered where none should exist. A settlement older than agriculture. A genetic pattern no one could explain. At first, these anomalies were dismissed as outliers. But as their number grew, so did the realization that our understanding of prehistory was incomplete. And then came the technologies capable of revealing what the Earth had hidden for millennia. LiDAR, the laser-based mapping tool that sees through forests, has uncovered ancient structures beneath dense tropical canopies, massive complexes in the Amazon, forgotten earthworks in Central America, buried pathways and mounds in Southeast Asia. Entire cities, once invisible, now glow in digital landscapes. These discoveries shattered the old belief that jungles were untouched wilderness. Instead, they were cultural worlds reclaimed by nature. If such complexity could remain hidden into the modern era, what else might lie concealed beneath forests, deserts, or oceans? Deep-sea archaeology has begun to provide answers. Submersibles equipped with high-resolution sonar have mapped submerged coastlines stretching for thousands of kilometers. In some places, researchers have found underwater terraces, stone scatters, or unusual formations that suggest human activity before sea levels rose. These are not yet proof of advanced cultures, but they are invitations to look deeper. For the first time in history, we have the tools to explore the drowned world. And while machines search the oceans, geneticists search our cells. Ancient DNA, extracted from bones, teeth, and sediments, has rewritten our understanding of human migrations. Where we once saw simple paths, we now see webs of movement, waves of people crossing continents long before archaeology predicted. Some migrations occurred in time periods where conventional history insisted no such journeys were possible. This genetic evidence hints at forgotten contacts, unknown settlements, and stories erased by climate or catastrophe. Meanwhile, archaeologists armed with new dating techniques, optically stimulated luminescence, calibrated radiocarbon measurements, improved stratigraphy, have pushed the timeline of human innovation further back. Suddenly, pottery appears earlier than expected. Ritual sites appear before agriculture. Monumental architecture predates cities by thousands of years. The puzzle is shifting. The pieces we once believed to be beginnings now appear as midpoints. Complexity appears where simplicity was assumed. Knowledge appears where ignorance was expected. And curiosity grows. With each discovery, the scientific community becomes more willing to entertain questions once considered fringe. Could early humans have developed knowledge systems we have not recognized? Could cultural sophistication emerge without leaving durable traces? Could climate events erase societies more completely than we ever imagined? The more we learn, the more we realize how little we truly know. But this curiosity is not merely scientific, it is deeply human. People across the world are drawn to the mysteries of prehistory because they sense something profound. The story of humanity is far older, far richer, and far stranger than the textbooks claim. Every discovery adds texture to our understanding. Every anomaly invites wonder. Every ancient symbol whispers a forgotten meaning. In many ways, this rebirth of curiosity mirrors the mindset of the very people we study. They too gazed at the world with wonder. They too sought patterns in the stars, rhythms in the seasons, meanings in the land. Their curiosity shaped early innovation. Our curiosity seeks to rediscover it. And perhaps that is the most poetic idea of all, that modern science is reconnecting us with the worldview of our ancestors. The technologies we wield today are merely extensions of the questions they once asked around flickering fires beneath open skies. What lies beyond the horizon? What stories does the earth hide? Who came before us? Where did we come from? And what have we forgotten? As we continue to explore, the boundaries between known history and potential prehistory blur. The rigid timeline of human progress softens. What once seemed impossible, early astronomy, early trade, early symbolic systems, now seems plausible. The forgotten world, once dismissed as myth, becomes a field of study. It is the dawn of a new era, an era in which science and imagination walk together. In which the mysteries of the deep past no longer intimidate us. In which we acknowledge that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In which we search, not with arrogance, but with humility. We may never find the full story of any forgotten culture that existed before the rise of cities. But we are finally developing the tools to search the unsearchable, the drowned coasts, the hidden valleys, the erased landscapes. We are learning to read faint clues with new eyes. We are learning to treat myths as memories, symbols as data, anomalies as opportunities. Curiosity, ancient and reborn, is guiding us toward answers that once seemed unreachable. And perhaps, in this century or the next, we will uncover something that changes everything. We often speak of civilization as though its definition were obvious: cities, writing, metal, monuments. But these are only the visible expressions of one particular path humanity has taken. They are not the only markers of advancement, nor are they guaranteed to emerge wherever intelligent humans live. To truly consider whether an advanced culture could have existed 10,000 years ago, we must first confront a deeper question: what do we mean by advanced? Modern assumptions bias us toward technological achievement. We imagine skyscrapers, metallurgy, complex machines, and large populations. But if we strip away the expectations of the modern world and look instead at the core functions of a thriving society, the picture becomes far more flexible. Advancement does not always mean technological escalation, it can also mean stability, adaptability, knowledge, harmony, or philosophical depth. So what truly defines an advanced culture? Consider first the mastery of the environment. A society that understands the rhythms of nature, seasons, tides, animal migrations, plant cycles, may be advanced in ways our technology-driven minds overlook. Early humans who engineered landscapes through controlled burns, selective planting, and irrigation-like behavior were manipulating ecosystems in sustainable ways. Their advancement was ecological rather than industrial. In some regions, humans achieved a balance with the environment that allowed lasting stability without depleting resources. Contrast this with modern civilization, which often consumes the world faster than it can replenish. If sustainability is a marker of advancement, some ancient cultures may have surpassed us. Another dimension of advancement lies in social organization. A society does not need vast cities to be complex. It only needs systems of cooperation, shared rules, distributed roles, conflict resolution, and collective memory. A small community of a few hundred people might develop intricate governance structures, ritual cycles, and intergroup alliances. They might build vast trading networks, not with armies or roads, but with trust, tradition, and periodic gatherings. Such a society would leave little physical evidence. But its social sophistication could rival or surpass that of later civilizations. What about knowledge? Not all knowledge is written. Some is preserved through oral tradition with astonishing precision. The navigational knowledge of Polynesian voyagers, encoded in chants and star maps held in memory, allowed them to cross thousands of miles of open ocean without compasses or charts. Australian Aboriginal astronomical knowledge, preserved through stories, identifies constellations invisible to the Western tradition and tracks cycles spanning thousands of years. If an early culture possessed similarly deep, orally transmitted knowledge, it could appear technologically simple while being intellectually complex. Advancement can also be spiritual or philosophical. Some societies create systems of meaning that guide behavior, preserve harmony, and give purpose. Such systems may take the form of myths, initiation rites, ritual calendars, or cosmological frameworks. These forms of advancement do not require writing, they require imagination, reflection, and collective belief. In fact, a society might intentionally avoid technologies we prize if they believed such inventions would destabilize their world. A culture deeply committed to balance might refuse practices that harm the environment or threaten social cohesion. Advancement, in this sense, could mean foresight rather than innovation. Yet another marker is symbolic expression. Art, music, dance, and storytelling reveal emotional depth and cultural identity. Prehistoric cave art demonstrates not only technical skill but an ability to communicate abstract concepts. Some carvings appear to encode astronomical or seasonal information. Others suggest ritual significance or early mathematics. Symbolic complexity is a hallmark of advanced cognition. It does not require large cities or metal tools. If we imagine a society that excelled in symbolic communication but relied on organic materials, much of their cultural heritage would be invisible to us. They could have developed sophisticated systems of notation, record-keeping, or storytelling without leaving behind durable evidence. And then there is the question of scale. Modern civilization is obsessed with size, bigger cities, larger populations, more industry. But complexity does not depend on scale. A small, tightly knit society may be just as advanced as a sprawling empire if its systems of knowledge and organization are robust. Some of the most harmonious societies in human history were small-scale. Some of the most destructive were vast. Which, then, is more advanced? When we ask whether an advanced society existed 10,000 years ago, we must consider these alternative definitions. We must free ourselves from the narrow lens of material evidence and consider that advancement can manifest in intangible ways. Imagine a society that understood the stars as well as any later civilization, but recorded their knowledge not in stone, but in stories and ceremonies. Imagine a culture that managed landscapes so effectively that it produced stable abundance with minimal ecological damage. Imagine a group that developed early forms of mathematics, symbolism, or ritual architecture, but built with wood or earth rather than stone. Such a society would be advanced by any meaningful standard, but nearly invisible to archaeology. It is also possible that advancement emerged not as a single invention, but as a constellation of practices, a refined understanding of seasons. A symbolic language shared across generations. A stable food system rooted in ecological knowledge. A cosmological worldview that unified diverse communities. A network of seasonal gathering sites serving as cultural centers. These components, woven together, could produce a culture both complex and resilient. But even resilience has limits. A single catastrophic event, a flood, a drought, a volcanic eruption, could dismantle continuity. Knowledge might survive in fragments, carried by survivors into new regions, stripped of context, transformed into myth. What remains today might be the faint traces of their influence, patterns of ritual, fragments of symbols, alignments of stone, and global myths that echo common themes. If we judge ancient advancement purely by monuments and metal, we blind ourselves to the possibility that earlier civilizations took different paths rooted in harmony rather than dominance, oral knowledge rather than writing, ecological balance rather than extraction. We might be the descendants of such societies, carrying faint cultural DNA in our stories, traditions, and inherited instincts. In the end, the question is not whether they built skyscrapers or smelted bronze. The question is whether they understood themselves, their environment, and the cosmos in ways we have forgotten. Perhaps an advanced culture did exist 10,000 years ago, not in the form of a city-state, but as a network of communities thriving in balance with the land. A society whose advancement was measured not in steel, but in wisdom. And if such a culture vanished, it would leave behind not ruins, but echoes. Across the vast span of human history, most cultures have vanished without leaving clear footprints. Their homes decayed, their tools crumbled, their stories faded into the wind. And yet, something of them remains, not always in artifacts or architecture, but in us. In the stories we tell, the instincts we carry, the symbols we repeat, and the patterns that emerge across the world even in places separated by oceans and millennia. These echoes, subtle, persistent, and often unrecognized, may be the last traces of forgotten societies that once shaped the human journey. To imagine such echoes, we must first understand how culture survives collapse. When a society falls apart or scatters, its physical structures disappear quickly. But ideas linger. Traditions adapt. Memories transform through retelling. Even when a people lose their homeland or their rituals, fragments of their worldview can endure for thousands of years, embedded in myths, embedded in language, embedded in the symbolic frameworks passed from generation to generation. Imagine a community forced to abandon its coastal settlement due to rising seas. The grand ritual center they built is submerged forever. Their astronomical markers lie beneath the waves. Their meeting places are lost. But the survivors carry with them fragments, a story about a flood, a belief about a star, a ritual tied to the rhythm of the seasons. Over centuries, these fragments get reshaped, simplified, mythologized, but they persist. Now imagine these fragments spreading across continents as populations migrate, blend, and evolve. The original meaning fades, but the emotional essence remains. A myth of a great flood appears in Mesopotamia, then in India, then in the Americas, then in Oceania. A symbol of a spiral appears carved on stones in Europe, painted in caves in the Sahara, etched into pottery in China. A hero who survives destruction emerges in stories from cultures that never met. These echoes hint at shared origins or shared traumas, memories carried across generations until they become mythic truth. Even more striking are the similarities in cosmology. Many ancient cultures believed the world had passed through previous ages, golden ages, forgotten ages, worlds destroyed and rebuilt. The Maya spoke of multiple creations. The Greeks spoke of earlier races of humanity lost to catastrophe. Hindu tradition describes cycles of cosmic destruction. Aboriginal cultures tell of dreamtime ancestors who lived before the current world was formed. While these stories differ in detail, they share a tone, a sense that something important was lost, something known before was forgotten. These myths could be nothing more than archetypal human storytelling, born from universal psychological patterns. Or they could be faint memories of real ancient upheavals, real migrations, real cultural collapses. If a forgotten society once flourished and vanished, its legacy might not lie in ruins but in stories whispered across time. Echoes also appear in practical knowledge. Consider the sudden appearance of agricultural techniques in multiple regions around the same period. Wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent. Millet in China. Maize in the Americas. Taro and yams in Melanesia. Some argue this is simply parallel evolution, different groups discovering cultivation independently. But knowledge spreads even when people wander far from their origins. A single traveler, a single family carrying seeds or techniques, could influence entire regions. If an early culture experimented with proto-agriculture before known civilizations emerged, its scattered survivors might have carried the knowledge outward in subtle ways. Perhaps they did not bring full farming systems, but fragments, a method of preparing soil, a way of storing seeds, a rhythm of planting tied to moon cycles. These fragments might blend with local traditions until they appear as independent inventions rather than inherited knowledge. Even language carries echoes. Linguists searching for the earliest roots of human speech find shared elements across vast families of tongues, patterns that cannot be explained purely by chance. Words for water, fire, mother, star often share similar phonetic structures across distant cultures. Could these similarities reflect a deep ancestral language spoken long before the rise of known civilizations? A language shaped by people whose story we no longer know? Some echoes appear in tools. A distinct shape of blade found from Africa to Europe to Asia. A certain carving technique that appears thousands of kilometers apart. These resemblances may be coincidence, or the result of widespread human nature. But they could also be the residue of a cultural influence now erased. The echoes grow stronger when we examine ancient alignments, megaliths, mounds, stone circles, or earthen structures oriented toward solstices or specific stars. Why did so many ancient groups, across continents, care about the sky? Why did they track similar constellations or assign them similar meanings? Why do myths from the Americas and Eurasia describe the Pleiades as a group of sisters? Why do flood stories everywhere describe a world renewed after destruction? Why do creation myths from Africa to the Pacific portray humans arriving from earlier cycles? These shared motifs may represent humanity's deep relationship with nature, or they could be shadows of a worldview inherited from a people who once observed the sky with extraordinary care. But the most powerful echoes do not lie outside us, they lie within our psychology. Humans everywhere seem compelled to build meaning from patterns. We seek connections, rhythms, cycles. We feel drawn to rituals that mirror the turning of the seasons. We instinctively create myths to explain our origins. These impulses hint that something ancient lives within us, something shaped not solely by evolutionary adaptation, but by cultural inheritance stretching into the forgotten past. Even our emotional responses carry traces of earlier worlds. A sense of awe beneath a star-filled sky. A fear of deep water. A fascination with fire. A longing for community rituals. These responses may be universal not because they are hardwired, but because humanity lived through ages defined by stars, oceans, wildfires, and communal survival. The echoes that reach us may be fragments of a worldview shared by early societies, perhaps even by one that rose to greater complexity before vanishing into the hands of time. If such a culture existed, what remains of it today? Not its monuments. Not its cities. Not its tools. But its influence. A story passed across continents. A ritual practiced unconsciously. A symbol carved in different eras by different groups who never met. A piece of ancient knowledge hidden inside a myth. A pattern in the stars mirrored in human imagination. A memory embedded in genetic lineages. A fear of the sea passed through generations after a great flood. A reverence for cycles that shaped early cosmology. The echoes are faint, but they are real. Perhaps they come not from one culture, but from many. Perhaps early humanity, across separated regions, experienced similar events and developed similar solutions. But it is also possible, quietly, hauntingly possible, that somewhere in the deep past a culture flourished, organized itself, cultivated knowledge, and then disappeared. And that its memory survived only as a whisper woven into the fabric of the human mind. If this is true, then we carry their legacy not in our museums, but in our imagination. We are the descendants of forgotten worlds, shaped by stories older than history, guided by instincts older than memory. And the echoes that reach us today remind us that our story is far longer, far richer, and far more mysterious than we ever dared to believe. As we reach the final steps of this long journey through prehistory, through floods and myths, forgotten rituals and shifting landscapes, we find ourselves circling back to the question that started it all. Not with the expectation of a definitive answer, but with a deeper understanding of the mystery itself. Could an advanced culture have existed 10,000 years ago? And if so, what would that mean for the story we tell about humanity? To answer, we must first let go of the idea that history is a straight line pointing toward us as its inevitable destination. The truth is far more complex. Human development is a tapestry of branching paths, parallel experiments, collapses and rebirths. Some threads are long and well preserved. Others are frayed, broken, or lost entirely. To return to the beginning is to recognize that our species has always carried the potential for complexity, creativity, and innovation, long before the rise of cities, long before writing, long before agriculture reshaped the world. Imagine again the people living just beyond the edge of our historical memory. They stand beneath the same sky we see tonight, watching constellations drift across the heavens. They feel the rhythm of the seasons, sense the pull of the moon on the tides, listen to the whispers of wind through grass. They understand the land intimately because their survival depends on it. They gather for ritual, celebrate life, mourn their dead, and pass knowledge from elder to child with the same tenderness and urgency that we do now. Their world may appear simple from the outside, but simplicity is an illusion created by distance. If we could walk among them, we might find that their knowledge of the natural world rivals that of modern scientists. That their rituals carry psychological and communal wisdom. That their navigation of the stars exceeds anything recorded in early historic civilizations. That their symbolic systems encode meaning we no longer recognize. Returning to the beginning means acknowledging a truth we often overlook: advancement does not always take the form of technology. It can take the form of understanding. Understanding each other. Understanding the land. Understanding the cosmos. Understanding the fragility of existence. If such a culture existed, balanced, observant, harmonious, it may not have left behind towering ruins. Its advancements may not have been carved into stone. Its achievements may have lived in memory, in chanting, in seasonal knowledge, in patterns of movement, in stories told around a fire. When catastrophe came, when seas rose, when climate shifted, those memories may have fractured. But echoes remained. And now, standing at a time when technology allows us to peer into the past with unprecedented clarity, we begin to sense what was once invisible: that human history is older, wider, and richer than the narrow band preserved in archaeology. Returning to the beginning means shifting our perspective. Instead of asking, "Why haven't we found evidence of an advanced culture from 10,000 years ago?" we might ask, "Why did we assume that such evidence had to survive?" The Earth is not a museum. It erases far more than it preserves. It shapes and reshapes landscapes. It buries coastlines and reveals mountains. A wooden settlement on a prehistoric shore, a ritual site made of reed and clay, a symbolic language carved into bark, all of it could vanish in less than a century. Yet humanity endured. And perhaps that endurance is the greatest clue of all. For even without physical remains, we sense that ancient people carried extraordinary knowledge. That myths hide memories. That symbols echo patterns far older than recorded history. That buried beneath layers of earth and ocean are the silent witnesses of forgotten ages. To return to the beginning is to ask not whether such a culture existed in the way we imagine, but whether we have been looking for the wrong signs. Maybe the earliest advanced society was not defined by cities or metal, but by something else entirely, something gentler, quieter, more in tune with the rhythms of the world. A civilization whose achievements were not built upward, but inward. Whose legacy survives not in ruins, but in us. If such a society rose, flourished, and vanished, what does it change? Everything, and nothing. On one hand, it widens our sense of wonder. It reminds us that humanity may have lived through eras of complexity we no longer remember. It humbles us, showing that our ancestors were not primitive but fully human in every sense. It deepens the mystery of who we are and where we came from. On the other hand, it confirms something we already know, that we are part of a continuum. That our story stretches deep into time, through countless generations who faced hardships, dreamed of better futures, learned from the earth, and passed their lessons forward. Even if no advanced pre-agricultural civilization ever existed, the possibility enriches our understanding of humanity's potential. Returning to the beginning means embracing uncertainty, not as a failure of knowledge, but as an invitation to explore. It means recognizing that the past is not fixed but evolving as new discoveries reshape our understanding. It means allowing ourselves to be guided by curiosity rather than certainty. And perhaps most importantly, it means honoring the unbroken chain of people whose lives shaped our present, whether they built monumental stone circles or simple shelters, whether they recorded their knowledge in myths or in memories, whether they survived catastrophe or flourished in stability. We are their continuation. We are the inheritors of forgotten worlds. We are the living archive of their resilience. In the end, the question is not whether an advanced society existed 10,000 years ago. The question is whether we can expand our imagination enough to see the possibilities hidden within the silence of prehistory. As we return to the beginning, we do not close the story. We open it. We step into a deeper sense of wonder, a world where human brilliance may have sparked countless times before leaving only faint traces behind. A world where rising seas and shifting continents hide ancient chapters. A world where forgotten knowledge whispers through myths, symbols, and instincts. And in that world, we find a truth that transcends evidence. Humanity has always been searching for meaning, for belonging, for the patterns woven into the land and sky. That search began long before the first cities, and it continues within us now. To return to the beginning is to recognize that the story of the forgotten society is also the story of ourselves, curious, fragile, enduring, and forever reaching into the mystery of time.